Chapter 16:16 Thank you. There was something about the shaking of the sphere that was particularly unsettling for Fifth Prince Sona. It didn't feel as though there was a battle, but almost as though something was awakening. What he didn't understand was what any of this had to do with sterile, and why these idiots were touching such a reverse scale. Didn't they see her wings? Even Leia had gone out of her way to stop Nosfaline from doing something stupid. If the wrong person was angered by this, all of them would be implicated. It wouldn't be a matter of logic and reason anymore. Fuck, Fifth Prince Sona cursed to himself. He had really gotten himself in some real shit this time. He knew that eventually, his need to participate in everything would come back to bite him, but couldn't it wait a few more years? It was already too late to not be involved. Nosfaline couldn't seem to see Leia looming over her at all. In fact, it was hard to see much of anything, her gaze being filtered through blood and blurred vision. Even so, the sphere in the distance was like a burning beacon to her. The moment it shook, she felt waves of relief, and quite quickly, that made the situation of her body all the worse. The instant she relaxed, all the injuries she had been suppressing burst. Her healing factor was excellent, especially in this partial beast form. But Leia's energy was too high level. It would take her days to recover without Silas, and that was before she went all out just now. But none of it mattered. None of it mattered so long as he was awake. The sphere shook again and an opening split open. A head of wild hair rose. Somehow, it both looked like the erratic hair of a wild man and a prim and proper one. It stuck out in jagged edges, but there wasn't a single split end or dry strand. Every dense curl and tight loop was well maintained and perfectly groomed, as was the handsome face it was all attached to. Silas stood to his full height, his eyes still a bit unfocused. The sphere of silver split open completely, unfolding into a disk that lay beneath his feet. And that was when they saw it. Sterile's eyes were opened wide, looking up into the skies with a half-vacant gaze. Silas' claws dug into her neck, her head snapped back toward her spine. What breath was left in her was so shallow it was hard to say if she was still alive at all, but Silas seemed to have no concept of what he had done at all. He needed Sterile because she was the easiest to control. She was part of the serpent lineage and didn't stand a chance against his will even while unconscious. If things continued as they were going, it would take him at least another week to wake up. However, after using his Grimblade lineage to devour Sterile's will, the timeline was cut short. He was barely able to regain a small bit of consciousness to get this information to Nosfaline just now. But even if she had thought of it on her own before, it would have been worthless unless he was awake enough to do what needed to be done. This was the earliest it could have been executed, and as far as Silas was concerned, it was just in time. He didn't seem to feel how close Fifth Prince Sona was to him. His gaze shifted and landed on Nosfaline, who was still gasping for breath on the ground, an unfamiliar young woman standing over her. Silas looked from Nosfaline to Leia with an almost eerie sort of calmness. His pupils dilated, the weaving lines of varying shades of emerald in his eyes moving in relation to one another as a subtle pull on time swept over the region. Leia felt her heart skip a beat as Silas' gaze swept over the battlefield. It was like he was peeking through the fabric of time, reconstructing everything that had happened while he was out. He didn't say a single word, but the longer he remained silent, the more time Leia and the Fifth Prince both seemed to have to regain their focus as well. "Do you have any idea what you're doing? Do you know where she comes from?" Leia growled, her Emperor Lion armor's helm moving almost as though a real golden lion was roaring at him. Silas didn't respond. He knew some things about the universal gene lock on angel wings. As a Reaper Sealright, he could feel it even clearer without needing to have the knowledge at all. But there was a prioritization of things that needed to take place. And right now, a loss was unacceptable. What they had done to Nosfaline. Even more unacceptable. Silas' claw flexed, his palm expanding and his claws unhooking from her neck. He took a step and vanished. Leia reacted fast, her staff striking out with a vicious momentum. Silas hadn't prepared anything. The thought that he could just take advantage of a spacetime affinity to get to her was nothing more than a joke. Clearly, he didn't understand who the Anale were. They were a race of beings who danced with time as though it was their closest friend. There was no sort of spacetime manipulation her eyes couldn't see through. Her staff hit nothing but air. Leia's eyes widened, her head snapping back, but there was no attack coming. All she could see was Scylla's broad back lowering by Nosphaline's side. Slowly, he picked her up, his senses sweeping over her body. He could see all of the problems with a glance, but just under the effects of his presence alone, they were already beginning to heal. Nosphaline's lips curled into a smile as her consciousness faded to black. She really didn't have the slightest bit of energy left. "Thank you," Scylla said simply. It was the last thing she heard before her world faded to black and her body disappeared into the hibernation realm. Chapter 16-17 Talker. Nosphaline vanished from Scylla's arms and they slowly lowered. Leia's gaze flashed with fury. It wasn't just about being ignored, or even the fact she had missed just now, though both of these things truly exacerbated her current mood. The real issue was that she had promised Robereda to get Nosphaline for her, and now she was gone. Unless she could force Scylla's to bring her back out again, there would be no getting her unless they went and found Scylla's after the gathering. Who knew where he could hide by that point? "Return her now," Leia roared. She seemed far more agitated about it than she should have ever been. Scylla's didn't seem to have heard her at all, his gaze tilting up into the skies as though he was watching something. He wasn't very familiar with this world, as he had only just woken up. Was this the demon world? A simulation? It was interesting, and it was no wonder Nosphaline had struggled so much. Using her abilities here required 10 times the effort because she was deciphering the demon world instead of the real world. If he were here to help facilitate it, it would have been easier. But without his support, she was handling all the computing power on her own and couldn't use his comprehension of demonic ether as a crutch. That said, Nosphaline wasn't the only one at a disadvantage here. The same was true of everyone else as well. Using techniques and things of the like was much harder, as was accessing all of their armors. It was just especially unfortunate for Nosphaline. While her abilities took about the same dip as everyone else's, her stamina drain was orders of magnitude beyond theirs. Nosphaline blamed herself, believing that she just wasn't as good at controlling her abilities and thus wasn't great at rationing her stamina. But that was barely 10% of the issue. Scylla's nodded to himself in understanding and then took a step. Leia's staff swung and missed again. Scylla's, however, appeared right next to 5th Prince Buri. The latter's head was almost completely reattached. Lying unmoving in a corner of the battlefield, surrounded by the protection of his army of people, he thought that so long as he had a few more minutes, he should be back up to at least a fighting state. Though not completely 100%, it should be enough to protect himself. Why would Scylla's allow him the opportunity? Stop! The centaurs and members of the 018 Sanctum charged Scylla's immediately. There was barely an air gap between them and the 5th Prince to begin with. With Scylla's appearing right in their midst, it was like he was delivering himself into their encirclement. Every single one of them froze in place. Their bodies were wrapped in a golden-green glow so powerful several of them screamed, their bones cracking beneath the pressure of Scylla's telekinesis. Scylla squatted down beside 5th Prince Buri's body. The latter's eyes were opened wide, but his neck hadn't fully fused with his spine yet. He couldn't control anything beneath his head at all right now. He could only look into those cold, emotionless eyes, the ring of gold around their swimming emerald colors piercing into his very soul. Any attempt he made to stir his will, to change something in a vain attempt to protect himself, was entirely crushed. Scylla's will was so far beyond his own it was like he was facing off against a deity. Maybe if he had his body, he could make it a real fight. But in a state like this, where he had no choice but to fight against Scylla's greatest strength directly, there was no chance at all. Scylla slowly reached a hand forward, his claws extending in 2 pairs. 5th Prince Buri's head squirmed, but he couldn't dodge as they pierced into his eyes with an almost agonizing slowness. Chaotic menace. Scylla's claws cut through his defenses as though they were made of clay putty. Without a throat under his own control, 5th Prince Buri couldn't even scream. He could only feel his eyes slowly burst, Scylla's digging deeper and deeper until he suddenly couldn't feel anything at all anymore. Scylla's claw dug into his brain itself, the blades at the ends of his fingers extending until they shredded everything in their path apart. Scylla slowly stood, pulling 5th Prince Buri's body up by his head as though he was some sort of human-shaped bowling ball. He looked around at his frozen protectors, his expression still much the same as it had always been. A disk of silver flew by, dozens of heads flying into the skies all at once. Just like that, the elites of the 018 Sanctum geniuses who held up the pillars of the F tier were all torn to pieces. Then they vanished. Fifth Prince Sona's eyes were as wide as could be. Insane. The both of them. It was like Silas wasn't aware that this was being watched at all. How did he think the Buri would react to this, exactly? Even he hadn't dared to kill the fifth prince of the Buri. What made Silas so confident that he could do exactly that? What the hell was he thinking? Silas stood amidst the carnage, his hand dripping with blood, but the corpse that had once hung from it was nowhere to be found. He was quite silent at the moment, but his next target couldn't have been more obvious. Leia. A sneer hung on her face. At this point, whatever cutesy sort of inclinations she had had before vanished into a long-abandoned ether. She gripped her staff and looked back at Silas, barely able to hide her disdain. I really can't believe this. A group of children really think themselves capable of pushing me to my limits. Are you under the impression that I fear you? Once again, Silas didn't say a single thing. In fact, other than the words he had spoken to Nosfaline, he hadn't felt the need to say anything. He wasn't much of a talker. If he wanted your head, he would rather take it and then say a few words to your corpse. Silas vanished. Chapter 16:18 Two moves for one. Leia felt her head turning before the spike of pain ran through her. Her body wasn't sent flying, and it could even be said that the strike was weak, much weaker than the attacks Nosfaline had managed to land on her, and yet it somehow stung just as much. Her staff swung out, yet Silas was already gone, a heel driving into the back of her knee. Her leg buckled, and her weight almost collapsed beneath her. She managed to recover in time, slamming the butt of her staff into the ground and using it like a third leverage point. She leaned onto it and kicked back with all the force she could muster. Bang! The air exploded, but the game of cat and mouse replayed itself. She missed entirely, streaks of exploded wind rippling through the air and yet not touching the slightest hint of Silas. Another fist landed on Leia's face, a knee to her gut, a foot that planted right on the center of her back. She roared out in fury, the mane of her Emperor Lion armor rippling as though solar flares of the sun itself. Chi. Leia Anale. Level. Physical, 433,387, adjusted, mental, 522,777, adjusted, will, 510,799, adjusted. Leia reacted as though a sledgehammer had suddenly split her skull in two. The will was so invasive that it was like someone had slipped their fingers into her skull and palmed her brain with both hands at once. Her body shook, and she spun around towards Silas' direction, her eyes returning to normal as though she had been snapped out of a concussive state. For the first time, she could see Silas clearly. Truly see him. To her shock, not only had her stats just been read, but she could feel Silas' presence far more clearly when she wasn't using the Anale's pupils. What ability was Silas using that his ability to feel reality superseded her own? That was impossible. Her expression became serious, but she also realized one very important thing. So long as she didn't use her special eyes, Silas wouldn't be able to trick her senses nearly as easily, and though his will was powerful, his other stats were far from on par. She stomped a foot and surged forward. This time, however, Silas didn't make a move to evade. His ability to see and react in a battle was far beyond anything that Leia had seen from any other F-tier. The moment he felt her dismiss her eyes, his tactics changed. His eyes unleashed a wave of pressure, the world twisting around him. Leia's fist was already before his face when her Emperor Lion armor suddenly collapsed. Her power dropped, and it felt like something had ripped a chair out from underneath her. While her actual stats didn't change, she was almost like a deflated balloon hanging in the air. In one moment, she had all the power in the world, and in the next it dropped by more than half. Silas almost carelessly sidestepped her attack, swinging out a foot toward her extended ankle. With a grab of her wrist, she flipped through the air. A danger the likes of which Leia had never before felt in her life shook her to her very soul. Despite her shock, she managed to react quickly, using telekinesis to rip some control back and away from Silas and avoid disaster. But as though he had already expected as much, Silas had already vanished, his free hand having found its way to Leia's staff in her distraction. Leia had been expecting to fly up into the air, reacting too late to suddenly being tethered to Silas through her own weapon. It was impossible for her to choose to let go. No warrior worth their salt would ever so easily abandon their weapon. She was yanked back, and Silas released her wrist, slamming an elbow right into the bridge of her nose. This time, Leia felt every bit of it. There was no armor anymore, no protections, and all she could do was meet an elbow with smoke-black fog radiating from it. Blood spurted out of her nose, the sounds of bones fracturing echoing through the air. Her vision swam, her body collapsing back to the ground. Her head snapped back on impact, and she tried to swing her lower body back towards Silas in some vain attempt to attack. Silas simply stepped to the other side of her staff, pinning it to the ground and raising a kick high in the air. He smashed down an axe kick with the momentum of a meteor streaking across the skies, space folding and a glow of emerald and gold rampaging through it as though a burning fury had manifested into reality. Boom! Leia felt as though her skull was being crushed. If not for the boost in constitution her treasure armor had, maybe that was exactly what would have happened. Fighting Silas felt like battling someone who could move 2 pieces for every one you did on the chessboard. It was suffocating, oppressive, and everywhere she turned her head, he was already there. You didn't beat someone like this with similar stats, or even slightly superior stats. Leia coughed up a mouthful of blood, her chest convulsing, but Silas had already raised a palm high into the skies. Ether howled, streams of black and green swirling into a massive lance that filled the skies. Even with her vision blurred, unable to see clearly, Leia could feel the danger, her pupils constricting into pinholes. "We will all die," she roared. Fifth Prince Sona's lip twitched when he heard this. He understood the implication. If they didn't have an explanation for what happened to Sterile, they really would all suffer. That explanation had to be Silas' head. "Fuck me," Fifth Prince Sona mumbled. However, his mare's maw had already opened wide, a roar of straight teeth glowing red gold as the heat in the region skyrocketed. He knew he had to give Leia a chance to recover. Clearly, she had underestimated Silas, and the moment Silas took control of a battle, he wasn't the sort to give it up. This battlefield needed a reset. Chapter 16-19, Glass Vault Throne 1. Silas didn't seem to hear Leia's words or feel the power accumulating from the fifth prince in the distance. He was instead looking at the armor on Leia's body. Weren't external items not allowed? Silas' senses shifted toward Nosphaline's new weapon. It was within the hibernation realm, and he raised an internal eyebrow when he saw it. "I see." Silas vanished, a beam of light tearing right through where he had just been. However, even after phasing through space, he felt a great, oppressive heat closing in on his back. The instant he stepped out, he felt that it was too late to dodge. Boom! Silas was enveloped in a spiral of flames, flickering and dancing. It pierced into the skies, waves of fire landing in the surroundings in a cascade of falling embers that were almost reminiscent of the blossoms that had been falling from Nosphaline's petalful mirage technique. Fifth Prince Sona landed beside Leia, who was already pushing herself up, coughing up another mouthful of blood. She reached up to her nose, snapping it back into place, and then wiped blood from her lips with a sleeve. The anger dancing in her eyes only seemed to be growing more palpable. Even without all her memories, she could remember the last time she had to take any F-tier seriously at all. It took everything within her to even take E-tier seriously in the first place, let alone this. And yet this boy played her for a complete fool. Reaching up, she pulled on the armor that coated her body, ripping it off as though it was made of wet tissue paper. In reality, her grip was so powerful that even in such a perfect state, it was entirely unable to withstand her strength. Fifth Prince Sona blinked, his gaze dancing between the pillar of fire in the distance and Leia. What was she doing? That armor was very valuable. Why would she destroy it like that? I would advise you destroy yours too. If you use it in front of him, it will cause problems. What do you mean? The fifth prince frowned. Don't bother to use your warlord armor either, she said, not explaining. She had a very vague memory about what Silas had used just now, but she couldn't piece it together. This was the problem with reverting to a previous state because of things like masteries and comprehensions. It was impossible to succeed without reverting the mind itself to a previous state as well. There were some methods of the annulay to mitigate this and keep some memories, but until they returned to their former strength, there were always going to be some memories left over to access. However, there were some memories that could be triggered based on a catalyst. Unfortunately, this memory she was trying to dig up in particular was probably tied to a former path of power she had once taken. As such, just seeing Scylla's unwind her armor from existence as though knocking over a house of cards wasn't enough to reveal it to her. Still, her instincts remained. She knew that taking her armor off was the smart decision right now. He took that attack point blank. I think you're overthinking things. He's very good at evading and taking initiative, but his actual stats are weak, and he doesn't seem to have any great abilities outside of his telekinesis and movement. Leia didn't respond again, looking at the pillar of fire intently. A sway of green shattered it apart. Scylla's appeared in an armor of striking emerald. It radiated with such great might it felt like the entire battlefield was being flooded with a light that originated from none other than the man himself. The tall tail of a scorpion warlord flickered, dancing with sparks of emerald lightning. Leia's pupils constricted into pinholes. How could a warlord armor be so powerful? It almost felt like her emperor armor. Earth escape, 5th Prince Sona said with a frown. Even though he knew, he still didn't understand. There shouldn't have been enough time for Scylla to do that. He's coming, Leia said coldly. You will support me from the back. She didn't wait for a response after saying this, her body swaying and vanishing. The next thing 5th Prince Sona felt was the shockwave of air, the concentric circles of rippling dust and devastating debris that sent those far too weak to participate in this battle flying. Leia and Scylla's fists met in the air, the former raising her free hand and staff into the air. With a single sway, space distorted as though a calm lake's breaking surface. Scylla's irises danced with a tesseract, his own ripples spreading out in a counter. Fuck, if you're layering so many variations in space, how do you expect me to support? 5th Prince Sona cursed. Bang! The words had hardly left his mouth when he was kicked off his horse. He was so focused on the battle, intently watching every movement, and he was still slow to react to the heel that drove across his face and jaw. His brain rattled in his skull and his eyes bulged. As his body was about to shoot off his seated position on the back of his mare, he forcefully tilted his head toward the kick, the gaze of a madman landing on Scylla's. Bang! He shot out, leaving a long line in the already destroyed battlefield. Scylla's landed on the ground to a pincer attack by 2, one being the golden-scaled mare, and the second being Leia. His eyes flashed, and his knees sank down, his palms striking out in 2 directions at the same time, a churning mass of power erupting from deep within him. Glass volt shift. Scylla's looked like he was bearing down for an attack. He could feel the constraints on space and the lock-on by the mare. But who said his only method of moving was spatial runes? He shot high into the air just when both thought they would be targeting him. Boom. Glass volt thrown. Chapter 1620 Glass Vault Throne 2. Scylla stood high in the skies, his throne to his back, bolts of emerald flashing wildly down. Every bit of land they connected with became a sea of glass. This battle, there was no need to extend it any longer. Shuuuuu. Runes danced, forming a cascade of barriers around Scylla's. One after another, it was like the world bent and whined. Scylla's had been out for almost 6 days now. He hadn't spent any time at all analyzing this world, and effectively, Glass Vault Throne should have taken him at least hours to raise to this level. But he didn't have to. That was because Nosfaline had done it for him. Every skill she cast, every tweak to reality she made, every shift in space and pull on gravity, she was comprehending more and more of the world around them. Even though it wasn't perfect, for Scylla's, it was more than enough. Waves of demons and armies of sanctums were turned into statues of glass, their wills blanking out of existence, crushed to nothingness. Scylla's raised a hand, his tail waving in the skies as though to sweep more and more glass vault into its core. Leia and 5th Prince Sona were very much mistaken. Sure, if he battled them the normal way, maybe it would take him a great deal of effort to finish dealing with them. He could play Leia like a fool, but they were right in saying that his stats were too low to deal a devastating blow to her. If he had even just 70% of her stats in effectiveness, she wouldn't last even a single exchange. The only reason he had fought them for so long was to stretch out his limbs and teach them a lesson. If he ended the battle too quickly, maybe they wouldn't realize who it was that sent them to hell. Lightning danced in Scylla's hair, the world shattering as ether formed around him, a glass vault that should have been far beyond his means to control reeled in by his throne. Space fractured and cracked, the whining of a world on the verge of collapse playing out before them. Leia's eyes widened. Fifth Prince Sona's fury was wiped from his face and replaced with horror. Then it appeared. A crown of bloodied blades, one that peeled away layers of emerald to reveal swaths of red and gold. A vortex of clouds formed above, a shuddering, oppressive might layering onto them all. Scylla raised a hand and grabbed, as though a god of lightning ripping bolts from the very skies themselves. It formed into a javelin of green steel so solid it didn't look like it had been formed of energy at all. It condensed in solid, subtle green, a radiant gold pulsing out from it in waves. He raised his hand, and though his expression was unmoved, his gaze calm, his breathing unhurried, his will was akin to a raging torrent that made one thing as clear as day: this was the cost for those that touched his bottom line. He took a step and space rippled beneath his heel. Reality was forcefully solidified around him, and his muscles flexed like steel cords. His arm cocked back and the world froze. Leia and Fifth Prince Sona wanted to move, but they couldn't. Their legs were frozen in place. As though reality had folded over them, molding to their skin and nailing their bones into place, they were entirely stuck. The deaths had already been decided upon. As they watched their armies frozen into statues, and the sky split as though the fury of the heavens was being imposed onto them, they seemed to realize something very clearly in that moment. They had made an enemy of the wrong person. Scylla wasn't talking because there was nothing to negotiate. He hadn't been planning on caring about the consequences in the slightest. For the first time in a long while, maybe due to Nosfaline, maybe due to this demonic world, or likely due to both. His demonic will had spoken. Why was pride a virtue? It wasn't just because without pride you would have no desire to do anything for yourself, to better your station, to prove to the world why you deserve to exist. It was because if you lowered your head when a line had been crossed, it wasn't just you who suffered. It was those who loved you who suffered as well. His pride would never allow that. Die. Bang. Scylla's arm moved in a snaking blur, his elbow flexing and his shoulder rotating almost violently. It was almost like he wasn't trying to kill two people, but instead to destroy the world itself. The javelin only seemed to shoot down toward a single one, and yet reality layered onto itself, Scylla's gaze dancing with a four-dimensional cube. Whether it was Leia or the Fifth Prince, both believed that from the very start, Scylla had always been aiming for them. When in reality, they were entirely beneath his notice. Air exploded around the extension of Scylla's fingers, shattering gusts of wind rippling out and leaving a long trail of destruction through the air as the javelin flew straight and true. And then the world fell into silence. Leia and the Fifth Prince both had the same reaction. Both were standing, unmoving in one moment, and in the next they had been impaled through the chest, a javelin of steely green ripping through their bodies, a will the likes of which they had never felt before manifesting it into reality. It was odd. The ground they were pinned to while still on their feet didn't shatter, didn't break. It was like only they deserved to suffer. And that was when a light appeared in Leia's eyes, that memory finally clicking into place once again. You. Her voice came out in a wheeze. Weave. Bang. Both of them shattered to pieces, their flesh vanishing into lines of emerald glass before exploding into bits, pieces, and shards. The battlefield had been reset, just like the Fifth Prince wanted. Chapter 16:21. There was a deathly silence. How could there be much of anything else? They weren't entirely sure what to expect if Scylla ever woke up. But weakness should have been the first thing. No one spent that amount of time asleep only to wake up as though nothing at all had happened. But Scylla was no longer a normal individual anymore. He was the only member of an A-grade race participating in this gathering. Leia would have counted as one as well, if not for the fact her body had been sealed away after her reversion. There was too much of her strength she wouldn't be able to see again unless she recovered more of her original power. Scylla's stats were only lacking compared to everyone here because he had, 1, not begun to build his foundation yet, and 2, because his original starting point was too low. His body was still adapting and changing to his new status, and things like this took time, years, even. This was all to say that the Grimblade lineage wasn't weak. The moment Scylla recovered enough consciousness to tell Nosfaline to get sterile to him, it was as good as over. Even she, however mysterious her background might have been, couldn't have ever stopped him from taking large chunks of her will away. Weakness. Why would he have to experience that at all when he woke up? But even so, there had been many who believed that Nosfailing was Scylla's greatest trump card, his strongest reliance. Summoners often tended to have powerful will, but the personal strength was lacking. With Nosfailing so heavily injured, unless he had another summon of equivalent strength or more, Scylla's was finished. How could they know that Nosfailing was already back to full health after a few seconds in the hibernation realm? How could they know that Scylla's still had Go-Go and the Hollow Wing? How could they know that Scylla's could have used semi-fusion to mimic all of Nosfailing's abilities even if she was in a heavily injured state? From the start of the battle to the very end, Scylla's didn't seem to have struggled in the slightest. When Scylla's spoke of questioning whether he could make it into the top 10 in the F tier, it wasn't because he thought there was someone who could defeat him. It was a matter of numbers, of stamina, and him questioning how much of his abilities he should display. It wasn't as though the 073 Sanctum had any ability to protect him should things truly go south. Plus, he had already thought of things from angles Ekir didn't, which was why he didn't make any guarantees. The trouble with guaranteeing victory was that he couldn't decide anything for certain about what might happen in the E tier, let alone the D tier or beyond. If he enraged enough Sanctums with his feats in the lower tiers, what if they decided to personally target the 073 Sanctum in tiers Scylla's couldn't participate in? What then? Even if Scylla's, by some miracle, got top 1 in both F tier and E tier, if the 073 Sanctum averaged 100th place in just the D- and C tiers, let alone the fact there was a B tier to consider as well, they would be ranked 50th just from those 4. With the B tier ranking becoming the average of their first 4 spots of participation since they had no B tiers, their average would fall even further from a potential top 40 spot. However, since things had reached this point, there was no need to waste time thinking about it more. What had happened, and his demonic will had settled down into a calm ebb and flow, growing stronger within him as a result. His will was polished, his mind clear, and he could feel the accelerated growth of his cells as his body grew into his new A-grade status all the more. All those on the outside could see, though, was the crown above his head. Primus Imperium. A youth of the 001 Sanctum looked up at the screen. While others had been watching the happenings intently, he didn't seem to have cared about anything at all until he felt that aura. He looked up with a sharp look in his eyes, a growl almost coming from his throat. The E-tiers around him almost all took a step back at the same time, their bodies shaking involuntarily. In fact, many of the D-tiers reacted in the same exact way, their hearts pounding out of their chests. Amend. It was a name they all knew in the 001 Sanctum, the number 1 of the entire E-tier, and a member of the Ape Warlord lineage. While Roboreda had formed her Serpent Emperor armor on her own, Amend had not. That was because he had been given the Ape Emperor armor by an Ape Emperor who had taken a great liking to him. However, when his clan thought he would join the Emperor Sanctum, Amend returned home without a word, became more closed off, and didn't speak with anyone. No one had known what caused this until a visit that happened a year following this. A Primus Imperium came, and unable to withstand his previous humiliation, Amend challenged him again. It was a battle that raged on for 3 days and nights, but ultimately, Amend lost again. For a battle of lower level E-tier at the time, to go on for so long, one could imagine the sheer amount of stamina and power they had. These youths were more than just the cream of the crop, they were a step beyond it. However, having suffered defeat once again, Amend only became more secluded, more closed off. Seeing that Crown of Blades triggered something fierce within him, the aura of a rampaging Emperor Ape forming from the fuming tendrils of crimson smog that radiated out from his body. It roared into the skies, beating its chest and shattering the silence that had been held over everyone. The only one who didn't react to this sudden outburst was Roboreda herself. She was looking down at her feet, her eyes cast over by darkness. Chapter 16:22 Nothing. Elbrum's eyes narrowed into near slits. His pupils moved from side to side as though slowly observing everything he was seeing before him. This, he didn't quite expect. In truth, he's still 100% sure how Scylla's had pulled off what he did earlier. However, if he had to guess, he assumed that it was related to his strength as a summoner. After all, Silas had essentially taken a humanoid and made him several times stronger. This was what summoners did, so it made sense he would have the ability to buff. What he didn't quite understand was how this was related to the boost to the warlord armor. As for Silas delaying the teleportation, that was easier to ignore. There were a myriad of ways that could have been done and Elbrum was less invested in this. If he had known that Silas didn't use an external treasure but instead his own Archon casting to do it, it was hard to say if he would truly still be so casual about it all. But regardless of that, the current situation, it wasn't easy to dismiss. The death of an Anale, the heavy injury to Sterile, the deaths of not just one, but two princes of the Thriskai. It was a complete shit show. Not a single time did Elbrum ever consider what Silas' backing might have been, assuming that if it was something decent he would know. But now it was the only question consuming his mind. That scorpion armor, it's perfect, isn't it? The Emperor Dove said with narrowed eyes. Elbrum didn't reply, but the look in his eyes said all that needed to be said. The Emperor Dove chuckled. That aura feels familiar, no? Watch your mouth, Deacon. Ho ho, sorry, my bad. Didn't expect to hit such a sensitive topic. But you know, if he has that aura, and comes from the 073 Sanctum, I wonder if his master knows what's going on here. Elbrum's eyes sharpened to the point a radiant amethyst began to exude from him. His Emperor Scorpion armor seemed to half-form, the end of his tail, missing its body hovering above its head while wisps of a violet flame hovered over a single eye as though a partial visor. The Emperor Dove didn't back down jokingly this time, though, his own armor likewise half-forming. A single wing, more beautiful than words could accurately describe, extended from his left shoulder blade, a white flame hover before his right eye likewise in the shape of a partial visor. What, you want to fight it out here? The grin on his face widened. Do you think I fear doing that? Would you even be a match for me? I see the delusions of grandeur have gotten to your head, not much unlike that cousin of yours. Does he think we're stupid? He's not an Anale, how did he suddenly come back one day with a perfect F-tier foundation? Elbrum suddenly moved, but what was an Emperor Dove if not speed incarnate? Let alone being caught off guard, Deacon had time to sneer, look Elbrum up and down from head to toe, and still casually vanish, appearing to his back. Boom. The high-level lookout shook, the glass threatening to shatter on impact. Elbrum was about to attack again, but this time it was the Emperor Lizard who caught him before he could move. Stop. There was a commanding undertone in his voice. The Emperor Lizard wasn't exactly the sort who knew how to be diplomatic, but Elbrum knew well enough that if he continued to fight, it wouldn't just be a one-on-one battle, Deacon would definitely take the opportunity to team up against them. I have to admit, though, Deacon said with a chuckle, it was a bit unfair that your cousin ruined his life because of a mistake he made as a kid. I'm proud of him for digging himself out, and now he's walking around with his head held high. I'm sure that he believes he's done nothing wrong. After all, had he been more patient back then, he could have easily done it himself with his talent. But if I'm right about all this, I don't he feels the same. Deacon's grin only widened as he pointed a thumb at Silas. What do you think? Is it a coincidence? I have nothing to do with what my cousin did to your sister. Elbrum said coldly. He had been growing more and more tired of Elbrum's jabs. He wasn't his cousin, he was his own man, with his own accomplishments. A flash of a dangerous light exuded from Deacon's pupils, but he did nothing at all. No, you don't have anything to do with it, that is true. But you also don't have anything to do with what my tongue does, now do you? If I want to make fun of your scorpion lineage's habit of biting the hands that feed them, I can do that, don't you think? Elbrum's reaction seemed to paint the picture of a man who had had his bottom line crossed. There were huge taboos even in the Emperor Sanctum, taboos related to one's lineage. Everyone knew that each lineage had their weaknesses, and the fairy tale of the scorpion and the frog wasn't just something reserved for Earth alone. Speaking on those taboos was as good at digging up a family's personal scabs as an outsider. It was completely unacceptable. But the contempt Deacon had for the Scoprian lineage was engraved into his very bones, and he had no reason to fear Elbrum at all. Suddenly, Elbrum relaxed his posture, his own sneer appearing. I get it, you want to piss me, blocking the methods I'll use to target him. You think I give a damn about an F-tier ant? I wouldn't even have to do anything, he'll suffer because of his arrogance all on his own. Deacon didn't respond to these words, it had nothing to do with him at all. Elbram was thinking too much. Scylla's death had nothing to do with him. Chapter 1623, The Weaver Guild. Scylla stood in silence, pulsing lightning still spontaneously sparking around him from time to time. His expression still hadn't changed very much at all, as though he hadn't done anything all that impressive. His head slowly turned in a direction and he took a step. He vanished in a whirlwind of runes, his body stepping through the folds of reality. Bang! Luca ran headfirst into the chest of Scylla's armor, his nose bursting into blooming lines of blood as he fell backward. Scylla's had noticed him a long time ago, he just hadn't cared enough to do anything. Reaching forward, he pierced through Luca's third eye. It was quite the irony. He had faced off against 3 Thriskai princes, and yet not a single one had had the opportunity to use their third eyes. Scylla's ripped it out and looked at the eye in his palm before crushing it. He did it purely for no other reason than he wanted to see what was unique about Luca's in particular. And he knew it would piss off the Thriskai. These people had stood in his way time and time again, he didn't have the patience to play games of politics with them. Lass looked up into the skies and his gaze seemed to pierce toward the spectators. This round, it wasn't over yet. 4th Prince Buri and Sona could be said to have the same reaction, that being that they had no reaction at all. One would have expected rage, a simmering hatred, but there was nothing of the sort. Instead, there was a silent stoking of a flame, and they smiled. It was a smile that took quite some time to appear, one with sinister, underlying intentions that seemed to want for blood. It wasn't just them. The 3rd princes. The 2nd. Only the firsts weren't here, feeling it unnecessary to do such things for the B-tier. The scope of the goals was very limited. Now it had one more thing. Kill Scylla's Grimblade. However, right this moment, Scylla seemed to be looking at them as well. His gaze was indifferent, calm, not filled with nearly the same fire as them all. He seemed to be silently contemplating something as he observed them one by one. And that was when something no one was expecting happened. Nosfaline appeared by his side, wearing a flowing white dress and a happy smile on her face, as though she hadn't just been beaten to the edge of her life. Scylla's flipped over a palm and handed over a bundle of something, a concentrated wool of pink that exuded the aura only a single person could. Leia. How many of these memories can you recover? Nosfaline blinked. It's too powerful. Scylla's nodded. There was something odd about Analay's will. While it seemed like an F-tier will, and he could even control it with decent ease, it also felt like a will that was impossibly far beyond that level at the same time. Ignore the more powerful, then. Claim only what you can. Nosfaline nodded, and her irises turned silver from blue, then began to light with rotating colors of pink, blue, and violet. Slowly, they solidified and blossoms began to fall around her. Her eyes glazed over and then sharpened considerably. Every thought she pulled out, Scylla's comprehended at the same moment. Then, he nodded to himself. The Weaver Guild was that powerful, huh? It was no wonder she had had such a reaction. Nosfaline had only been able to pull out memories that Leia had recovered before her death. Thankfully, Leia had made the connection right before she died. Trouble was, this wasn't all good. For one, the Analay were actually one of the pillars of the Weaver Guild. Though, they were formed of 7 separate main races. That left an obvious question, then. Analay's memories from her previous incarnations were easier to recall the more core to her being they were. The fact her race was Saki in the Weaver Guild should have been a big deal to her, enough to remember long before, right before her death. So why? Probably the same reason she was here as a member of the 002 Sanctum rather than with the Weaver Guild. The truth, the Weaver Guild made the Emperor Sanctum look like a children's playground, though technically they were in the same general tier of strength. This was probably an important mystery to solve first, and it made trying to use the Weaver Guild to get out of this more complicated. What had the sloth said? The Weaver Guild were probably already looking for him. That much was true. Given what he now knew about the guild, it was definitely for positive reasons. Whether they would still be positive after they knew he had killed Leia, though. Well, that wasn't certain. That said, there were 2 things of great importance that Scylla had learned through Leia's current memories. First, she had targeted Nosfaline because of Roboreda. Why would a former A tier be following the orders of an E tier? The answer was even simpler than anyone knew. Leia loved Roboreda and would do anything for her. There was no complicated scheme at all. This Roboreda was a little interesting. A rune master who managed to unearth an Emperor armor on their own was curious. But this wasn't because Silas respected her rune mastery. What made this feat impressive was her ability to sense the will of the Emperor Serpent. Maybe only Silas would be completely uncaring about the rune mastery aspect of the feat. But as far as he was concerned, only a true genius of will would be capable of this. It also required a particularly hard head. As for the second thing Silas learned, it was that Leia was unlikely to be dead, not truly. Her foundation would be harmed, and she would have one less reversion to use in the future, but Anale didn't die so easily. This meant that there would likely be an A tier waking up very soon who wanted nothing more than his head. Chapter 16:24 The Rules. No, she wouldn't be an A tier the moment she woke up. But, if she was enraged enough, she might choose to take a path she already did and make it back to A tier within a few months at most before deciding to come after him. Normally, she would only need to return to D tier to guarantee Silas' death. But since she knew about the Weaver Guild, she might think that he had extra protection and go all out. By this timeline, for the worst-case scenario, I have 4 months. Troublesome. 4 months would barely put him out of this gathering. In fact, it was very possible that the gathering would still be ongoing in 4 months. Elbrum had sped up the timeline for the F tiers, but it was still a question of whether he would do the same for the E tiers and beyond or not. And even if he didn't, there was still the matter of the C tiers and B tiers. Regardless of the sanctum, he had to treat those level of masters with more respect as they were the backbone of the Warlord sanctums. In that case, this might drag out for even longer. Even after having cut things short, they were already approaching over a week spent on just the F tiers alone, and this segment didn't show any signs of stopping anytime soon. Silas looked up into the skies and shook his head. From what he knew from Leia's memories, Anale only had a set number of times they could reset, and this reset was a huge opportunity for them. The reason Leia was loitering around the F tier wasn't because she couldn't blitz back up to A tier, but instead because she was trying to maximize her foundation as well. Every time she reset, she would take a new path and use it to progress all the way up to A tier, improving more and more every time. The hope was by doing this perfectly enough, she could only day burst through the ceiling that was the S tier and become a true overlord powerhouse. But even if she failed, just by doing this alone, every time she returned to the A tier she would be far more powerful. By her last attempt, she would be amongst the strongest A tiers beneath the S grade races. The question was if she would be enraged enough with Silas to waste one of her returns just to get revenge on him or not. And Silas bet that would probably be decided by if he suffered at the hands of someone else first or not. Leia probably didn't know for sure that Silas planned on participating in the E tier, but she probably had her guesses. She was probably even more certain of how arrogant he was after his actions too. Silas didn't believe that a Leia with all her memories would still be so infatuated with Roboreda. Someone who had been reincarnated so many times had probably fallen in love plenty of times, and with all her memories intact, what she felt for Roboreda would certainly fade. In that case, it was a real crapshoot as to what would happen if Silas just happened to put a blade through her heart. Silas closed his eyes, calculating something. After a few minutes, his eyes shot open and he took a step. The scene that played out next was unlike anything anyone could have expected. Silas had defeated Leia and the Thriskai, but altogether they only represented a few hundred to just over 1,000 warriors at most. Behind there were still sanctums that had numbers in the hundreds of thousands for F tiers alone. It was one thing to overpower them, it was another matter to expect Silas to go all out and defeat them. However, just staying pat wasn't an option either, that was because the numbers of the demons in the still oncoming waves would grow to be too much as well. By the time the 6th wave came, they were already rivaling strength of the top 30 sanctums, by the 7th it would be top 25, and the 8th it would be top 20. As things continued, even Silas would be quickly overwhelmed by the sheer fatigue of it all. If the F tier was all he had to worry about, he could certainly pull it off. But right after this, the E tier battles would begin, and given Elbrum's proclivities, Silas didn't expect that he would get any rest at all. So, he chose to play a game of chess. There was a reason Silas told Ekir that whether or not he could win would depend on what the rules were. Since they changed every year, it was impossible for him to know whether there would be things to take advantage of or not. Luckily, there were. There were three main cruxes of Silas' plans, but they all basically revolved around the same matter. The demon waves. The first important point was that where your demon wave spawned was dependent on which territory you were in. The second important point was that your demon wave, should it spawn where another group of another sanctum was, you would be tasked with destroying both waves, otherwise it would also count as a loss. The third important point was that if your sanctum was split up between multiple territories, you would receive a demon wave for each one, and unless you successfully cleared them all, you would be counted as having failed and would be teleported out. These were the intricacies of the world they were playing in, and the outsiders could only watch as Silas abused it all. He infiltrated territories, forcefully teleporting out small segments of sanctums into new ones. He triggered double waves for unsuspecting sanctums and forced them to fight against his own demon waves for him at the same time. Moving through one battlefield after another like an assassin in the night, he was a nightmare for whatever sanctum he chose to target next. The names on the list began to whittle down one after another, and even when they thought things would slow as he targeted the more PWFul sanctums, they didn't. It was a one-sided oppression led by a single man. Chapter 1625 Odd. Silas stood on the last battlefield, a lion warlord of the 004 sanctum hanging from his hand. Because of how things had worked out, the 001 sanctum was actually one of the very first he finished wiping out. They were so confident and hadn't been targeted by anyone since the start, so they had been extremely vulnerable to a sudden assault. By comparison, the 004 sanctum was quite lucky because this time, they would end up ranked second. If anything, they should be thanking him. The lion warlord coughed, his eyes still filled with shock. He couldn't believe it. Silas was littered with wounds and looked as though he was barely standing. Yet the problem was that all the injuries he had suffered were surface wounds. They were the sort of injuries that, at a certain level, wouldn't even impact combat strength. It was almost like Silas had allowed himself these injuries for cosmetic effect. You can either give in, or you can die. The choice is yours, Silas said calmly. The lion warlord's teeth clenched. He was the strongest of his sanctum, and yet he was being treated like this. It was infuriating. However, there really was no other choice. With a thought, he gave up, and those that remained of his sanctum followed him. Silas felt the weight in his hand vanish and he looked up into the skies with a calm exhale. This was about how he expected things to end. Was there a need for him to be surprised? The leaderboard up above flickered. 1.073 sanctum. The list following their placement was just as ridiculous. The 004 sanctum became second when there had never been a change at the peak, and third place was actually the 028 sanctum, a flip that didn't make any sense at all. This was strategic on Silas' part as well. Deciding how to defeat everyone was easy enough, but defeating them in an order that maximized his odds and chances was another matter entirely. Everyone was probably too focused on the fact he was winning to really consider how he was winning. There were 2, even 3 games of chess going on at the same time. While he wanted to come out on top, that was only one problem to consider. What he also needed to consider was how he was going to deal with the fallout. He had pissed off quite a number of sanctums, and without him, there was no chance the 073 sanctum would be able to deal with things properly. If they were targeted by too many powerhouse sanctums, then maintaining an average of 73rd place would be impossible. However, who said that making enemies was the only possibility? Who said he couldn't make friends? Sure, these friends wouldn't stick their necks out for the 073 sanctum, but so long as he picked them strategically, they would trim the edges of danger they faced here and there. In the end, Silas was playing a game that was several layers deep, and he didn't plan on losing. The world trembled and Silas was wrapped up in a strong pulsing light. The victor had been decided. When Silas appeared, the entire platform shook. It was hard to say just how many people were looking at him, but his expression was much the same as it had always been. Calm, cool, indifferent, focused. He was already planning out what to do next. The same strategies he had used in the F tier could be used in the E tiers, but they would require several major tweaks, especially since everyone had been watching him. They would be ready with their own counters, so he had to dig a layer deeper. Silas finally looked up after several seconds to find that the look the various 073 road warlords were giving him had completely changed. Whether it was Aranya, Erethi, or even Priyan, they had all known that Silas was a great talent. But they hadn't truly contextualized it until this moment. What Silas had done wasn't simply being the best amongst the F-tiers of the Warlord Sanctums. Just being the best wasn't enough to change the fate of an entire sanctum. He was not just the best, but the best by such a wide margin that the gap in numbers hardly fazed him at all. The largest leap in a single sanctum's rank over the course of a single cycle was only 12 spots. The largest leap for a single tier rank was 27 spots. Silas had jumped them up 72 spots. If they maintained their average of 73 for all the remaining rounds. Just this result alone would be enough to jump them up 13 spots, breaking the record entirely. Everything Priyan had said about Silas just being an F-tier they had to work around rather than a basket to put all their eggs in just felt ridiculous now. This wasn't someone they had to look at as an F-tier. This was someone who might very well have the strength to kill any one of them the moment he reached the D-tier. That was a completely different set of circumstances. And the scariest part. They didn't believe that Silas had used his full strength. He had fought alone despite showing that Nosfaline had already been brought back to full health. And what the other sanctums didn't know was that Silas could fuse with Nosfaline. Boom, boom, boom. The formations shook and the platform beneath them began to rise. The 073 sanctum had been brought up to the level of the top 30 sanctums, but now it was going even higher until it came to a stop. Their platform leveled out with the top 3 sanctums, rising above even the other top 10 platforms. The sounds of Elbram's claps resonated through the arena. I have never seen such a perfect display of scorpion might. A wild grin spread across his face. I also never thought the value of a single disciple could outweigh the value of millions of others. You have truly proven yourself, Silas Grimblade. Silas' gaze flickered. Something was odd. Chapter 1626. Silas turned to face the projection that loomed high in the skies, his gaze calm despite the sheer amount of attention he was receiving. He could feel that while most of the gazes were leveled in awe and shock, there was a substantial portion of them steeped in something else entirely. There was anger, rage, a deep desire to kill aimed toward him. In a sea of people with such powerful wills, one could imagine just how much pressure that would put on a single F-tier like Silas. If not for certain divisions, even Silas will would show signs of collapsing at this moment. And yet, it was under these circumstances that Elbram chose to elevate him to the same level as the top 3 sanctums. If it was just about rearranging them in the order they finished in, the 004 sanctum, which finished second, would also be raised to this level, while the 002, 003, and 001 sanctums would all be knocked down, as not a single one of them finished in the top 3 like they usually did. However, that didn't happen. I have to say that I have never been so thoroughly impressed by an F-tier. While I cannot promise you top 3 treatment into the next tiers, I can give your sanctum the benefit of partaking in the energy recovery stratus of this level nonetheless. Consider it a token of my appreciation of your talent. Silas nodded calmly. Thank you. The others around Silas blinked, not expecting him to say such words. But it was also clear they had too little understanding of Silas. While extremely confident in himself, Silas wasn't a fool. When it was time to be under the Grimblade's control, he had accepted it without much pushback. What exactly would be the point in refuting Elbram at this point? It would be at that point that pride would become a sin. Not only would it not help him, it would harm all those around him, making it near impossible to achieve what he wanted. Even Elbram seemed surprised by Silas' reply, but in the end he just smiled, his gaze flickering. He immediately elevated Silas' place in his heart by not just a single level, but several. There was no doubt about it. This Silas was extremely dangerous. In that case, we will move on to the E-tier. Elbram grinned from ear to ear. The task will be just the same, nothing has changed. Prove your right to earn your right to prove yourself. Silas' expression didn't change at all when he heard this. Instead, he took a seat and closed his eyes. Large amounts of ether began to surge toward him, so thick they formed plumes. They divided into two lines, entering his body in torrents. His healing factor seemed to have been injected with steroids. It was much harder for him to heal now because the standards of his body were so much higher. But Silas had managed to compensate with the sheer quality of his genes. There was little better one could have than a full slate of legendary genes. So long as he could focus, and use maddened enlightenment, the results would be good. He didn't even react as the E-tiers vanished around him. What was the rush to tell them that he was participating? There was no shortage of people who wondered if he would. Given the strength he displayed, although getting first was impossible, claiming a top 50 spot for the 073 Sanctum shouldn't be all too difficult for him, maybe even 40 if he used some of the tactics he displayed. With this, the 073 Sanctum was guaranteed to move up quite a number of places. But Silas didn't look like he was going. The 713th Beast Warlords all looked toward him with hesitation. But after a while, they sighed. Wouldn't it be too shameless of them to try and make an F-tier who was clearly already heavily injured help them more than he already had? They also knew how many enemies Silas had made with his feats. It would almost be like sending him off to his death. So, they suppressed the desires. He isn't participating. What a surprise, Elbram muttered under his breath. Maybe because you need a lesson in subtlety, Deacon said with a sneer. Elbram didn't reply directly to the insinuation. I've already said what I need to say to you. He would never recover in time without this help. I don't think he needs your help at all. I think he's already proven that. Not necessarily, the Emperor Lizard suddenly spoke, his gaze more focused on Silas now than it had been before. It seemed that even he had taken somewhat of an interest. It isn't as though the rules say he can't still join. This is just a preliminary, randomized round that Elbram added superficially. He's probably waiting. The Emperor Dove looked over. You mean he wants to be the one to challenge the 030 to 040 Sanctums on behalf of the E-tiers of his Sanctum? It would be a good way to gauge if he has the strength or not. And I bet he's also confident in reaching the edge of the platform in case he isn't powerful enough to protect his life otherwise. Elbram's eyes narrowed, his gaze still on Silas. The randomized tournament continued swiftly, and without Silas, the 073 Sanctum was lucky enough to win the first round, making it into the top half of the bottom 40, but they weren't so lucky again, losing the second. After that, the losers' brackets played out and they ended up with the overall rank of 077. All the while, the strongest of them, Aranya's disciple Morvicus Serpentis, who had already suffered a loss at Silas' hand, never got a chance to even raise a weapon. Frustrated, he could only stand there, completely unable to do what Silas had done for the F-tiers. As the time ticked back, the wounds on Silas' body were only swiftly healing, and when Elbram was about to speak again, his eyes shot open. Chapter 1627 The Only One. Silas stood to his feet, looking up into the skies. I would like to represent the 073 Sanctum in this coming battle. Elbram's gaze had never left Silas. In fact, he had already paused his words the moment he saw him stand up. Quote, and does the 073 Sanctum accept this? Priyan's eyes blazed. We do. Elbram nodded, his head turning toward the E-tiers of the 073 Sanctum. But it was clear that none of them dared to refute. What a joke. Silas hadn't even been a fraction as strong as he was now when he defeated Morvic, their undisputed number one, especially without Gwenu here. Of course, that was because Silas had used his Vipermancy profession. But they didn't need to know that. What was clear now was that even without the Vipermancy profession, Silas was on a whole other level than them. In fact, he was probably a strong rival for the D-tiers as well. There were some who believed he could have defeated Brian Majesty during their confrontation all those months ago. Now, whether that was little more than illusion or not, only time would tell. I see. In that case, I will give you all the same opportunity as I gave last time. If you believe yourselves to be beyond your current ranking, if you believe that I am being unfair, a random of the Sanctums between 031 and 040 will be chosen to fight your very best. Step forward. You have 30 seconds to choose your champion. Silas vanished and became the only person on the arena. It was clear that the 073 Sanctum had already chosen him. The arena felt large and lonely. It was at least 100 times larger than the F-tier arenas had been, and yet despite running for their lives, not a single one of the F-tiers who attempted to forfeit managed to make it to the latter's edge. How much harder would it be to run on an arena this size? The moment the battle began, they would be teleported right to the center of it all. It was nothing if not daunting, almost like a psychological weight piercing into the psyche. It seems that this time, we have only received one participant. Elbram's words fell after a full half-minute. It seemed that the bottom-ranked sanctums had learned their lessons this time. After watching one massacre after another, only Silas would ever dare to participate in something like this. Silas felt the world warp around him and he was instantly transported to the center of the arena, the space he had been waiting in, feeling like a whole world away. There was a ripple, and the behemoth that appeared soon after seemed taken aback for a moment before his gaze landed on the puny Silas before him. Silas didn't recognize this person, but everyone else did. That was because before Silas awoke, Nosfaline had killed someone in brutal fashion who looked almost identical to this man. The 033 Sanctums Boran. Instantly, there was a flash of fierceness in the huge man's eyes. His blue skin rippled, his gills flashing open and closed. His cousin had died brutally at the hands of Nosfaline. Bring her out, he growled. Though he hadn't been aware of what happened, he was pretty sure of what the problem was now. It didn't take a genius to figure out. Silas' only response was to check his stats. Fulnum Burnge, E+. Level, 100. Physical, 771,389, mental, 501,777, will, 688,799. Fulnum felt as though a cold chill wrapped all the way through his body the moment his stats were unearthed. There was a cracking at his neck, a necklace that once protected him falling into pieces. There was a moment of silence as he seemed entirely stunned by what had just happened, but Silas himself didn't seem to react as though he had done much of anything at all. Instead, there came a glow from his eyes. Slowly, piece by piece, the layers of his runeweaver eyes were removed. As each layer of protection collapsed, it was like the ring of gold around his emerald swimming irises became brighter and brighter until they practically projected light beams onto the battlefield. Silas' hair danced, green and gold swimming around him in a torrent. Fulnum slowly regained his bearings and then seemed to snap. He roared, his gills opening wide, and large amounts of water-type ether swirled into being around him. He began to form his whale warlord armor out of habit and pure fury as he lunged forward, but Silas' pupils pulsed, dilating and then constricting once. His whale warlord armor was torn to pieces before it could even successfully form. Silas reached out a hand to his side and it morphed and changed, strings of silver scales reflecting with pinks, violets, and blues erupting down its length. His hair became a long sea of white, his eyes dilating in radiant blues. Name: Silas Grimblade, FFF+, level, 50. Physical, 475,555, mental, 2,225,588, will, 905,455. In a single instant of time, the whale warlord armor formed in perfect harmony with it all, his strength skyrocketing to another level as seas of ether surged toward him. Madness. Silas' body flashed and he appeared right above Fulnum, striking down with a single fist radiating with the strength of his telekinesis and ether. Boom. Fulnum's skull split beneath the blow, his head flattening, and his face shattering the arena below. He lost consciousness immediately, not even feeling when Silas landed on his back moments later. There was a deathly sort of silence hanging in the air, one barely broken by the reverberating echoes of the blow and the cracking foundation of the arena. The scales slowly faded from Silas' body, as did the whale warlord armor. He took a slow breath and exhaled, his body feeling loose and limber. He didn't know if he liked using the whale warlord armor or not. It put quite a bit of stress on his will to keep everything in line. But when it was worth it? Well, the results spoke for themselves as Fulnum breathed his last. Chapter 1628 The Sanctum. Silas exhaled a breath and stepped down from the body. There was a flicker of runes around him, and he was pulled off of the arena and sent back to the top tier with the 073, 003, 002, and 001 sanctums. He didn't seem to notice, looking down at his own knuckles to assess what damage there might be. Using his telekinesis to amplify his own physical strength was quite effective. It was practically like adding 350,000 stat points to his physical. But the problem was that his base constitution stats were too weak. Without a balance in stats, one was bound to drag down the other. The good news was that this could be mitigated in two ways. First, there were his scorned raps that gave him a plus 100% in his base constitution. The second was to be more clever with his application of telekinesis. He could split it into two streams, one that was offensive and another that was defensive. Unfortunately, for the time being, the former was the far better solution. Just coating your body with telekinesis wasn't the advantage you thought it was. Every joint moved independently, and the timing also had to be perfect. You couldn't just treat the body as one object, otherwise, you'd lose dexterity. There was a give and take, a push and pull every time you applied telekinesis to yourself. For example, if Silas wanted to throw a punch, accelerating that punch at the tail end of the attack just before it landed was the easiest method, but it wasn't the most effective method. Getting into the weeds could easily greatly complicate things. There was a reason though there were a large population of telekinetic ability users here, only Silas was using his to amplify his body so frequently. Others preferred easier methods. It's its own martial art, Silas concluded. One I'll have to figure out very soon. As of now, there was no damage to his hand. But he bet if he could perfect his telekinesis as a true extension of his body, there would be no need to worry about his constitution at all. Silas looked up and saw rows of gazes looking at him with fear and trepidation. And then he looked past them, feeling a different gaze. For the first time, Silas saw Robereda. She had a calm to her at this moment, one that exuded complete confidence. Silas completely ignored her, giving her a sparing glance as though he didn't even register her beauty. The moment he sensed the scent of a serpentess, he knew that she would be irrelevant. It was someone else who he sensed as far more of a threat. Amend. Plumes of crimson rippled off him, and Silas continued to observe him as though he was interested in something. After a moment, Silas looked away. What exactly was the point of getting into a pissing contest with a moping, petulant child? Up in the skybox, Elbram looked at the corpse that remained for a long while, not starting the next phase immediately. He could feel it, that wasn't entirely Silas' physical strength. That was telekinesis. But as shocking as that was, it still wasn't what he was the most concerned with. Those below didn't know, but they, as members of the Emperor Sanctum. They did. Maybe everyone thought it was simple enough. If you got a summon who was a strong enough rune master, and you got a profession that allowed you to fuse with your summons, then you could use as many warlord armors as you wanted. There were probably some fools down below wondering why they hadn't thought of such a method before and if they could get their hands on such a profession. In fact, they probably believed that finding the actual profession was the easy part. Fusing summoner professions were a bit rare, but not to the point of being unfeasible. They certainly existed in large enough quantities that a sanctum that wanted to move heaven and earth could find more than a few. If they used them as rewards for the best disciples, maybe they could connect their lineages more meaningfully. What not a single one of them understood was just how impossible this was. Time and time again, the same phrase was brought up when speaking of the sanctum. They weren't an organization of rune masters. They were an organization of wool masters. To master a warlord armor, and especially an emperor armor, meant embodying every bit of the beast you projected the wool of. To try and hold more than a single wool inside of you was like trying to serve two masters at once. To be capable of perfectly aligning with a completely separate wool just because you felt like it. It was almost like changing the very core of your being at a whim. The spirit beast race was a race of beings quite literally born to hold countless wills inside of them. However, even they only picked a single one to follow. All but a very select few of them capable of following more than one. These were the monsters that stood at the pinnacle of their Emperor Sanctum, monsters who either currently ruled, or would one day rule them. In this entire generation, there were only two. But Silas was no spirit beast. If he was, Elbram and the others would have already sensed it. He was an odd breed of human, one that seemed to have a bestial aura that wasn't entirely clear. But maybe the reason it wasn't so clear was precisely because he had multiple beast wills within him. Could he be Elbrum's pupils constricted into pinholes, and he looked to the side to find the Emperor Dove and Emperor Lizard already looking toward one another. It was clear they had also come to the exact same conclusions. The sound of their breathing was the only thing that echoed in the skybox for a long while. "Contact the sanctum," Elbrum said. When Elbrum spoke of the sanctum, he could only ever be referring to one place. Chapter 1629 Convergent. It's too difficult. It will take months. They also won't be expecting this. If we use the energy here for the sake of establishing contact, we won't have enough to form the C-tier or B-tier battlefields. If we're wrong, the punishment. The Emperor Lizard spoke out his thoughts slowly. When he was finished, Elbrum felt that even he had been hasty. But that just went to show how important this matter was. The system was very antsy about more powerful beings interfering in weaker territories. When the Golden Grove built its bazaars in the Milky Way galaxy, there were many limitations on how it could interfere even then. Some thought that building subsidiaries was a loophole that could be exploited. But at least in this regard, the system was very consistent. The Emperor Sanctum might have many subsidiaries in weaker territories, but they were very limited in the ways that they could interfere. In fact, had Silas not been on those steps, he might very well still have his legendary Scorpion Emperor gene to this day. In order to set up something like the Gathering, there wasn't only a tremendous amount of resources needed, but it also required a lot of preparation to hide things from the system. Whether it was Elbrum, Deacon, or the Emperor Lizard, they were all also only D-tiers for just an added bit of safety as well. Simply put, contacting the Emperor Sanctum now had to be a last resort. However, if we are right and we don't report this, the consequences will be even more grave, Elbrum said. This time, the Emperor Lizard didn't retort. A human showing signs like this had to be examined. On Earth, the concept was known as convergent evolution. The philosophy behind it was simple enough. The world was biased towards certain characteristics that gave one race a higher likelihood of being powerful and surviving, so the same traits tended to appear again and again. The angel wings of Sterile were one such thing. But they were heavily protected behind a gene lock that influenced not just a single race, but the entire universe instead. This was how important it was to races to protect their most pivotal characteristics. Breaking the ceiling on such a thing was akin to threatening the very existence of a race itself. Silas was edging too close. The mix of wills in his body, his ability to control them, his human-like characteristics matched with an overwhelming will. It was like the universe was trying to create another spirit beast. That was completely unacceptable. Too few understood the limitations of races and the climbing hierarchy of the universe, but there was a reason why the Thriskai could only have 7 mortal clans, 7 demigod clans, and 7 god clans. This formed the entirety of their quota, and it was representative of a treaty they had with the other god clans of the universe. The fact they had so many quotas at all just went to show how extremely powerful they were, but pointing out this example wasn't to speak of the Thriskai, but instead of the general situation of the entire universe. The system only had so much bandwidth. There was a limit to how many things it could focus on at a given time. However, there was an open secret that everyone innately understood but never really put into words. The system was created using the universe as a template. Before there was the system, there were other systems of improvement, ones that were less efficient and far more difficult to make use of, but they existed nonetheless. The universe only had so much energy, and while it was focused on improvement, it was doing so for the sake of survival. If too much of its energy was used up, the universe and everything in it would die. Every society in some form had a concept of this. Even Earth knew it as heat death. To compensate, the universe only allowed the most worthy to have its energy, placing trials and tribulations before them. That bore out to a limitation on the power singular clans could have on the scale of the entire universe. For one to have, another must be taken from. When one was taken from, only then could another have. Some philosophers believed that there were an infinite number of paths one could take to the top, but the universe had existed for so long now. Any paths that hadn't been explored were so obscure and difficult to tap into that they might as well not exist at all. As such, even new, up-and-coming powerhouses often accidentally stepped onto paths that had already long existed. And right now, it seemed that Silas was doing exactly that with the spirit beasts. He had the aura of a scorpion, an ape, a serpentis, and a monkey all within him right this moment. Whether he wanted to admit it or not, he was mimicking the first ancient spirit beast. Now, whether he was on the path to converging onto them couldn't be assessed unless a true powerhouse descended and Scylla's genes were personally scoured by them. However, someone like Scylla's couldn't just be casually targeted by them. For one, Elbram and the others couldn't even personally act against Scylla's. And second, dealing with Scylla's alone wouldn't fix anything. Who and where were his clan of people? Did he have children? How many places had he spread his seed already? If Scylla's was found to truly be converging onto the path of the spirit beast, not just he needed to die. Every Grimblade and potential Grimblade needed to die with him. All of a sudden, the three emperors went from butting heads to being entirely in alignment. They still weren't sure yet, but there was no doubt that they had to make certain of it too. And, ironically enough, they also needed to make sure that he didn't die. Otherwise, finding his origins and clan would become orders of magnitude more difficult. Chapter 16:30 Monster. Scylla's vision warped. Without warning, the E-tier trials began. There was a flicker in his gaze as he found this to be very odd. Usually, Elbram would announce something, but he could only bury it to the back of his mind for the time being. He didn't like to speculate on things he didn't have enough information about. Instead, he looked around for his teammates, only to find that they were already gone as well. Doubly odd. He had been about to tell them to leave as they would only complicate things, but Elbram had done this for him as well. Very odd, indeed. Scylla stood in silence for a short while before he focused. He knew that this matter wasn't going to be nearly so easy. The average E-tier participating in this was orders of magnitude more powerful than the F-tiers. And his suppressive abilities didn't work as easily on him either. However, though it would be far more difficult, he still had every intention of coming out on top. No one here was going to be the one to stop him. A roar pealed across the skies. Fuck, Deacon cursed, not understanding what he was seeing at all. Was that an E-tier combat mount? How could an F-tier have something like that? Mounts weren't just something you could give to someone else. They had to be personally subdued and then tied to you, which likewise meant that all of its evolution had to be related to you as well. The problem. Mounts couldn't usually progress beyond the tier you got them in. The vast majority, even the best of them, would forever be stuck at the tier they were bound in. If there were such restrictions for mounts, one could imagine that the restrictions for combat mounts were even more exaggerated than that. Now, given Scylla's strength, one could easily say that maybe he had just targeted an E-tier from the beginning. He had just killed an elite E-tier of a top 35 sanctum with a single punch. Was that really so hard to fathom? The problem with that assessment was that the hollow wing was too fucking powerful. In a single blink, it crossed over 500 kilometers. It didn't need a rest, and in another blink, it had crossed another 500 kilometers. And before the first wave of demons could even descend, Scylla's was already no longer in his territory anymore. This wasn't just any combat mount, it was a king combat mount. It was completely unheard of for a king combat mount to submit to a user from a tier beneath it. They would rather die. Even if it was a Primus Imperium. That was to say that not only was this a king combat mount, it was a king combat mount with the ability to cross tiers during its evolution. The worst part of all of this. Given the ugly expressions of every one of the warlords of the remaining sanctums, it was clear they had all seen it as well. The battlefield for the E-tiers was easily an order of magnitude larger than the battlefield of the F-tiers, but it had still taken Scylla some time to cross those distances and make it to new locations. They believed, after assessing the situation, that Scylla's chances of taking advantage of the rules like he had during the F-tier would be nigh impossible given his speed. Even if he increased that speed tremendously, it was also clear from his battle with Fulnum that it took a lot out of him. He wouldn't have the strength left over to do as he needed to do. That was all to say that Scylla's knew they would come to this conclusion. Given the fact it was his combat mount, even in the F-tiers, Scylla's could have taken out the hollow wing. It wouldn't have been registered as an external item, nor would it have been breaking the rules. He didn't bring the hollow wing out despite the fact he could have ended the F-tier battles in a flash with it because he didn't want those that had entered the E-tier demon battlefield to know. They would never see him coming. A flicker of something new began to appear in their eyes as they looked at Silas, the sort of look you could only give a person who shattered your expectations at every turn. He was dangerous. Regardless of his personal strength, if he were to grow. Maybe there would be a day that the top 3 sanctums were no longer just 3. They couldn't help but look toward a certain Rhino warlord youth who was still in a daze after his increase to his power. How many people could Silas do that to? Suddenly, something they thought to be a fluke had become something so much more. Monster. A ripple shuddered through Silas' will, his Primus Imperium title and champion will suddenly becoming more prominent. The effectiveness of his will shot up, and any hints of fatigue he had were wiped away in an instant. His eyes narrowed, not quite understanding what happened until he asked the Pride Madness key. Was that so? Primus Imperium responded to the acknowledgement of the people. Then why didn't Dominus Paragon match it? Was it because they didn't know about his Dominus Paragon title? Or what about his Primus Luminaria title? The hollow wing suddenly came to a stop high above a territory. His eyes sharpened as he looked down from above. He had to be quick, and he didn't know the layout of his demon world just yet, so he wasn't actually sure which sanctums were located where. What was interesting was that the 064 sanctum hadn't made any moves this time, so it was the 073 sanctum alone from the bottom 60 that was participating. They likely felt that after the terrible position in the F tier, there was no salvaging things anymore. That was to say that when Silas ran into the 040 sanctum, he had run into the lowest rung sanctum here. It seemed his luck wasn't bad. His palms slapped together, a surge of ether forming into runes as 2 waves of demons formed and charged toward the unsuspecting sanctum. Chapter 16:31 Fuck. Silas' eyes remained tightly closed as he meditated on the world around him. He quickly formed runes and watched them shatter, adjusting and adapting. Drawing runes in the demon world without them being demon runes, and yet trying to use real-world runes to comprehend a demon world. It was about as complicated and convoluted as it sounded. Silas' only chance of turning the tide in this world was to comprehend it as well as he did the F-grade world. The issue with that, obviously, was that this was an E-grade world and his mastery over E-grade runes was pathetic. It only took him a single second to realize it was impossible. Not only because his mastery over E-grade runes was pitiful, but also because his glass vault throne growth skill could only be most effectively used on F-grade level things. It wasn't an E-grade growth skill for a reason. Silas had already guessed this would happen, but he needed to make doubly certain first. In that case, this wasn't going to work. He was going to need a different approach. The hollow wing vanished as a beam of light cut right through where they had been just moments before. Silas, though, didn't even flinch. He knew that just hiding high in the skies wasn't going to be enough, but he was also very confident in the hollow wing's evasion abilities. When you could blink away a full 500 kilometers with ease, there was no need to be worried about speed. Fuck. Lee knew they were fucked the moment they saw Silas from above. The 040 Sanctum was already borderline participants here. The first waves of demons were set with them as a limit. Meaning, if they suddenly had to face double the number right off the bat, they would be under a great amount of stress they wouldn't be able to easily deal with. Although they should survive, they might not have enough speed to do it before the second wave appeared, and they would certainly take a great hit as a result. To make matters worse, Fulham might not have been the most powerful of the 033 Sanctum like his cousin had been, but he was still more powerful than a good 95% of their number here. If Silas could just flash down and one-shot critical members whenever he wanted, they were as good as finished. Suddenly, Lee's gaze flickered. He knew exactly how to screw Silas over, and his fury became subterfuge. They were the 040 Sanctum anyway. Losing here, at worst they were ranked 041 due to the addition of the 073 Sanctum into the fold. So what? It would be far more pleasing to watch Silas squirm here, facing 2 waves he couldn't deal with at all. He had only just had the thought when he felt a palm land on his shoulder. WHO. He spun around viciously only to find a beauty standing behind him. There was a flash in her eyes, and he immediately went into a daze, his last thoughts that of the incredulousness of it all. How had Nosfaline become so powerful? How could they know just the sort of power-up the beast totem could give Silas contracts? And if Nosfaline didn't have to worry about stamina, why would she still hold back in how much power she used with her gene beast forms? Silas already knew the greatest vulnerabilities to his plan. It could be said that he was both lucky and unlucky that he had run into the 040 Sanctum first. The moment they felt that the situation was too unmanageable, they would have the most incentive to just give up. Taking out their obvious leader would slow the decisiveness down a bit, but it wasn't the perfect stopgap measure. Nosfaline vanished before she could be drowned out by attacks. Fuck, Lee roared into the air as though he had broken free of Nosfaline's hold. Fight these fuckers to the death. However, it was clear he had not. It was one thing to take out their leader, it was another matter to manipulate him into doing their bidding for them. This first wave was just weak enough that the 040 Sanctum's underlings wouldn't realize there was a problem until it was too late. Now it was just a matter of paying close attention and taking out anyone who might want to follow in Lee's footsteps. But in this regard, both the carrot and the stick could be used. Silas closed his eyes and slowly pressed his palms together. A pair of golden slit eyes appeared on his back, the world trembling around him. All at once, the serpentous armors of the beast warlords below reacted as though they had been given stimulants. "To the death," they roared. Beacon. Silas wasn't able to fully subdue Etir Serpentis. He also wasn't able to easily subdue these humanoids either. Technically speaking, they weren't real Serpentis. They were somewhat like Nosfaline before he turned her into a contract. If he manipulated and changed their genes more, he could turn them into contracts, but they couldn't be influenced as easily. However, Silas didn't need to rely on Vipermancy alone. Vipermancy was little more than a foot in the door, a wedge to stop them from scurrying away. The rest of the work was done by Nosfaline. Though, in the end, maybe it was still Vipermancy. Triggering semi-fusion, Silas used Beacon, the Beast Totem, and Silken Reverie, all at once. The Serpent Warlord armors were all pulled out from their bodies and buffed at once. Their eyes glazed over and their bodies shuddered with extra might. Lee, their leader, had already charged ahead, his own Serpent Warlord armor blooming with flashing lights as they cut into the army of demons with a vicious moment. Layering so many abilities on top of one another, Silas was quickly burning through his fuel, but this first step had to be taken perfectly. He couldn't accept a loss here. Not this early. While the Serpent army took the helm, the Hollow Wing roared and unleashed a violent attack from above, not toward the Serpent Warlords, but the rest of the 040 Sanctum. Those in the outside world could only watch what was happening with horror in their eyes. Chapter 1632-3. Silas took a deep breath and exhaled, his expression a bit pale. He closed his eyes, knowing that he had won the first battle, but was likewise very much aware that he was running out of time to get to the second. There were only about 3 hours or so until the next wave. An hour. Silas took a seat on the Hollow Wing's back, continuing to take deep breaths. Corpses of the members of the 040 Sanctum were littered around, and the last of them having been personally killed by him, while the vast majority had ended up leaving. By now, he had definitely exposed the sheer amount of control he had over the Serpentis. But if he hadn't done so, he knew that he would have been screwed over. There was definitely no way he could have defeated 2 waves of demons on his own without the 040 Sanctum as a shield. Silas' eyes flashed open after exactly an hour passed. He still had lingering issues from his previous unconscious state, but they were mostly minimal problems. If he didn't push himself too far, that was. Unfortunately, he didn't have that luxury right now. He needed to scout. The Hollow Wing shot into the air and flashed away. Silas' eyes darted around as he crossed through one territory after another. There were 40 sanctums participating, separated into an irregular grid across the battlefield. Each battlefield was at least 2,000 kilometers across, and accounting for the roughly square to circular shape of the battlefield itself, the diameter was around 12,000 kilometers or so. It took the Hollow Wing 26 to 30 blinks to cross from one side of the battlefield to the next with its current strength. This allowed Silas to quickly map out the regions and form an understanding of where all the sanctums were located. Now, he could pick his next target more strategically. Silas began putting the Hollow Wing into the hibernation realm and pulling it out continuously. Although he could have used the hibernation halo instead, hibernation halo required active use of his will, while the hibernation realm did not. He had to save his strength where he could, so though it was a little inconvenient and less effective, so long as he wasn't in the middle of battle, this was the better choice for him. After an hour, he had a full scope of understanding of every battlefield. However, because of his choice, he had also likely been exposed by some of the sanctums as well. There was no choice. If he was going to get close enough to tell which sanctums were where, then he would also be exposing himself to likewise being seen. This seemed to have made the fact Silas hid the hollow wing useless, but this wasn't the case. For one, Silas hadn't been seen by every one of them. Only about 10 or so of the remaining 38 sanctums now knew he had such a fast method of travel. The problem was that those 10 sanctums were also the 10 most powerful of them, but that was going to have to be an issue for another time. Second, just because they knew Silas had the hollow wing now, didn't mean they had as much information as those watching from the outside. From everything they knew, they likely felt that something like the hollow wing's blink ability could only be used a limited number of times. They had no idea how continuously he could use it, and many of them believed that he had used up those opportunities to quickly escape them. Silas stopped in the air. There was an hour left now. The question was, how best to take advantage of the current layout of things. Time ticked away, and everyone seemed to be waiting for Silas' next move. But as time continued on, and the moment of the next wave's start inched forward, those of the 073 sanctum began to grow antsy. Was Silas waiting until the very last moment? That made sense in part, since it would save him the hassle of being attacked by those in control of certain territories. But given his strength, he shouldn't have to cut it this close, right? 3. 2. Silas' eyes opened. The members of the 073 sanctum almost fainted. Silas hadn't moved at all. He had returned to the territory of the 040 sanctum, and now the second demon wave had been triggered. Silas took a step and fell from the hollow wing's back, exhaling a calm breath as Nosfaline stepped out from a swirling portal of gold by his side. Her skin rippled with scales, and she returned to her peak condition, a trident pulsing with light in her hands. Deal with large threats, I point out. Otherwise, just watch, Silas said calmly. Watch very closely. Yes, Master, Nosfaline said with a pleasant smile. Silas clenched his fists, and the lower half of his sleeves shattered, his scorned wraps manifesting in dancing lines of bloodied bandages. His calves followed suit as he took a step forward, his ether thrumming with life and vitality. The ground shook as the second wave of demons closed in, their bodies surging ahead with a momentum that seemed to have the world at their beck and call. Morphing Earth Demon, E, level, 100. Physical, 520,000. Mental, 500,000. Will, 500,000. Not just one, but sea after sea of them, thousands stacking atop thousands, and tens of thousands more following after them. For a single F-tier to be facing off against this kind of threat seemed little more than foolish. No one could understand what Silas was thinking at all. Silas' chest bulged, and what remained of his turtleneck tore to pieces, flying off into the wind. His eyes glowed with the majesty of an emperor, the ring of gold around them only growing more volatile. He took a step forward, and the ground shook once again. But this time, it was because he commanded it to be so. In a blink, he had vanished. Chapter 1633 Mixed Demonic Arts. Silas appeared before the first wave of demons, and it felt as though he had become a completely different person. Until now, he was calm and collected, his eyes the picture of a cool chill, every one of his actions calculated and thought out countless steps ahead. While he was violent, it was nothing short of controlled. While he was merciless, it was nothing short of by design. But the moment his canines flashed, his hair dancing into the air, his muscles rippling like steel cords layered onto one another in a fine mesh of power. It was like he had become something else entirely. Something that was hardly human at all. Mixed demonic arts. He slapped down the palm of a slashing demon claw, hooking an elbow across its chin with an explosion of his telekinesis. Its head burst into a flower of poorly molded mud, but it was already snapping back together in the next instant of time. These demons had constitutions with effectiveness that was off the charts. Not only were their mud barriers hard to break down, but even upon breaking them down, they could easily reform. There was no part of them that seemed to be capable of being targeted for a lethal attack unless you could shred them to pieces entirely, and the moment you got hung up on a single one of them, there were 10 more ready to follow up in the next instant. However, Silas acted as though he didn't understand this at all, his legs sweeping out in a continuation of his combo, pulsing with an emerald light as his telekinesis surged once again. The creature was knocked off its feet, and Silas' heel came smashing down from above. The scorned wraps surged and tore into its body, finding purchase on something deeply hidden and ripping. Silas didn't even look back after crushing its head into paste, trapping the swinging arm-turned axe of another mud demon to his waist. He took a step back, arching his head out of the way of yet another attack. Telekinesis grabbed onto the body of the demon he was holding onto, sending it sprawling forward to follow his motion. With a pivot of his foot and a twist of his hips, he launched it over his head. It sparked into flames and shattered to pieces in the air. Silas continued on, his mind calculating out dozens of moves ahead. Somehow, every time he maneuvered on the battlefield, he was capable of forcing one continuous series of one-on-one battles after another. It was almost like the demons were lining up to fight him in a calm procession when in reality, they didn't have this sort of patience at all, nor did it have anything to do with Nosfaline. Silas' ability to control the battlefield after reading the attack patterns of the demons again and again had become unprecedented. This battle, he wanted to use it to ingrain his understanding of those exact attack patterns once again. This wasn't the real demon world, these were simulations, and all simulations had their limitations. And if even the system that the universe as a whole relied on could be manipulated, how much easier was it to manipulate a simulation created by an organization that couldn't hold a candle to the system's original creator? Silas' scorned wraps pulled on the ankle of a mud demon, spreading its leg out into an uncomfortable split in the same motion as Silas' rising axe kick, a line of connection formed between both of their ankles. Silas' heel descended in a violent torrent that split its body in two, sparkling lines of silver and black ether carrying the air of space, time, and chaos, forming the blunt attack into the sharpest blade on the battlefield. Not a single motion of Silas was wasted. The push and pull, the ebb and flow of the battlefield danced on the palm of his hand. Kicks easily parlayed into controlled grappling maneuvers, dodges shifted enemies out of position, and attacks blocked the opportunities of other demons from targeting him. Silas' claw ripped through the chest of a mud demon, tearing out a pounding crystal in the shape of a heart. He crushed it in his palm, and runes burst from its body. He slapped out with the same hand to the side, the runes of the heart compressing, and then... boom! A line of a dozen demons was eviscerated in a single instant. Yes. Silas knew that he was correct in that moment, but he didn't stop, his attacks becoming more furious and relentless. He tore into bone and flesh, mud and crystal as though they were one and the same. Every moment he made was reflected in Nosfaline's eyes a million times over. Months of close combat instinct Silas had grown over one life and death experience after another, being bored into her very psyche with one bloodied attack and impenetrable defense after another. Silas stomped a foot and roared, the ground quaking as he suddenly explosively increased his killing speed. 9 morphic silver bearings concentrated into balls as small as palms and yet as heavy as mountains. One crushing weight after another swung, and it was like Silas had gained 9 new limbs at the same time. As he moved a graceful arc of utter violence, the silver bearings of complete destruction followed along with him, leaving arcs of silver, emerald, and gold in the air. All of a sudden, it didn't even look like Silas was losing stamina as he fought. It looked as though he was regaining his breath with every passing moment, his movements becoming faster, more assured. Every demon he killed, he added a new bit of information to his growing algorithm, and then... whoosh! A glowing golden crown appeared above Silas' head as though a halo. His pupils danced with the concentrated light of a tesseract, and at that moment, the battlefield was blanketed with a peculiar aura. Silas vanished from one location and appeared in the next. A fist struck out. He vanished again, appearing in a new location, striking out with a sweeping axe kick. He vanished once more, swinging down with a claw that split space everywhere it passed. Somehow, Silas was everywhere and nowhere at once. Boom, boom, boom. A chain reaction of destruction shook the battlefield. Chapter 1634. Silas stood on a battlefield all alone, his chest moving rhythmically and yet his breath sounding akin to a steaming engine. Violent upswells of heated air billowed out from his lungs as though a dragon breathing fire, the air sparking with emerald streaks of lightning from time to time. Nothing but carnage was laid at his feet. Silas looked up into the skies. 3 hours. He nodded to himself. With the help of the 040 Sanctum, it took him 21 hours to finish wiping out the entire army. Granted, there were 2 armies, but there had been far more than just Scylla's alone. This time, however, Scylla's took a 1/7 of the time all on his own, despite the fact this demon wave was stronger than the last. It was a result that no one had expected at all, but it was one that Scylla's had known was possible from the very moment he saw that his enemies were somehow breaking the rules and wearing armors. He bent down and ripped out another crystal heart that pulsed with runes, his gaze hard to read. There was a heavy silence in the outside world. At this moment, even the 001 Sanctum was still in battle. They were close to wiping out what remained of the wave of demons, but none were like Scylla's, who wasn't fighting anymore at all. The main issue was that they had all seen Scylla's fight with their own 2 eyes. At no point did he use a strength that overwhelmed that displayed by the top-level Sanctums. It didn't make any sense what they were seeing. Again. This was already the 2nd time Scylla's had done something they couldn't make sense of. But the illuminated crown that had only just flickered out of existence above his head seemed to paint a completely different mystery quite clearly for them all. Dominus Paragon. The Dominus Paragon crown wasn't one that appeared for the same reason as the others. When a Primus Imperium was dominating in their field, asserting the dominance and crushing their enemies with raw strength, that was when the crown would be stimulated to appear. It would also appear when something that was being done that would otherwise be impossible without it was occurring. For example, an F-tier using E-grade ether. When a Primus Luminaria was exerting influence over its abilities, its crown would likewise appear. This would be when an F-tier was using E-grade runes. But it would also appear when it was displaying absolute dominance over rune mastery as well, and especially when the runic path that triggered its appearance in the first place was being used. Of course, either one of these crowns could be summoned by its wielder whenever they wanted to as well, but at that point, it would be for little reason other than cosmetic. Though, in the case of Primus Luminaria, it could also be used to suppress other rune masters. It was just unfortunate this ability had many limitations, so Scylla's rarely used it. However, for Dominus Paragon to appear, it was only triggered when someone was exceeding the scope of their chessboard, displaying a level of intellect not just beyond the feats they had performed in the past, but even beyond what most watching him were capable of comprehending. Even when Scylla's had forcefully raised the level of that Rhino Warlord disciple, it hadn't appeared. And yet, here it was now. He has already won. The voice came from an individual who had been all too silent until now, a young man who radiated the aura of AD tier but seemed far more reserved than many of the other bestial personalities around him. Even so, his words carried a great deal of weight. That was because, despite being of the 007 Sanctum, he had an identity that was heavier than most could fathom here. He, too, was a Dominus Paragon. However, his title of Dominus Paragon was orders of magnitude more shocking than Scylla's own. That was because he was from a sector that could house a branch as powerful as the 007 Sanctum. Even the smallest powers in this section of the universe could wipe the floor with the Milky Way sector and even the Milky Way horizon as a whole. Yet he, as AD tier even amongst Cs of B tiers, was the one who held this title. He was quite the low-key individual. In fact, he wasn't even a part of the 4 main lineages and was instead part of a very interesting lineage. The Scorpion. Dystopian Vuntal, just 22 years old this year, and yet having stepped into the earliest reaches of the D tier. Rare were the words he spoke, and yet that only made them carry all the more weight. The other members of the 007 Sanctum looked toward him, but it wasn't until a hulking man with a neck seemingly thicker than even his massive biceps looked toward him that Dystopian said anything more. The 713th Lion Warlord of the 007 Sanctum wasn't known for his patience. And even if he hadn't been, even Dystopian wasn't arrogant enough to ignore the glance of AB tier. He's reverse engineered the simulation that produces the demon waves. He can understand what they're going to do before they do. The Earth demons are powerful, but their vulnerabilities are very obvious. If you can sever the connection formed between their crystal cores and the mud that makes them up, they will die. Before she died, the Anale made it a point to take off her armor. I think she realized something we did not, and I'm pretty sure I know what that is now. Scylla's Grimblade has been graced with the Runeweaver profession, and he has likely upgraded it beyond the E grade. If he can see through the simulation, then his attacks can be as much as a tenth as powerful as that of the demon waves and still kill them all with a single strike. But that much is still not the key part. If I'm correct, Scylla's Grimblade is also a Primus Luminaria. Chapter 1635 already. It's just a guess on my part, but I don't believe that the Runeweaver eyes, even upgraded beyond the E grade, would be capable of doing what we've seen without Primus Luminaria also allowing him to manipulate runes above his tier. If I'm correct, the Anale took off her armor because she knew she would be in more danger with it on than with it off the moment she sensed the change in things. As for the specific details of it all, I'm afraid that without being there myself, I can't tell you. Only he would know. A silence fell once more, the words Dystopian had spoken earlier ringing in their ears again. He's already won. Scylla squatted down and picked up a crystal from the heart of a demon, rolling it around in his fingers. The real reason he had gone out of his way to fight with the O4O Sanctum was because he couldn't be sure of how things would translate on the E-tier battlefield. He needed a buffer between himself and the demons so that he could observe them and make certain that his previous deductions were correct. After he was finished, there was no need to worry about these things any longer, as they would certainly work out in his favor. Following that, he simply didn't need them anymore. If he wanted to, he could just stay in his own territory the entire time and win just based on time survived. With things as they were now, it was likely that even the 001 Sanctum couldn't outlast him. This was why he also didn't care if he exposed the Hollow Wing or not. It didn't make much of a difference. Dystopian was right in part, though. This was all related to the armor Scylla's had seen. How was it that they were breaking the rules? Scylla's didn't believe that something like that would be so blatant. Although he wasn't a fool who believed that the world was always fair and just, he did know enough to know that only an idiotic power would ever hold such an event, only to allow the projection of cheating to be displayed to absolutely everyone. Although Elbrum's actions had been plainly unfair, they still provided a chance and opportunity. Plus, if Scylla's was correct, he highly doubted that he would ever allow things to continue so flippantly for the higher level struggles. He would probably be more buttoned up by the time you got to the D tiers and higher. So that left the question of how. When Scylla saw the demons, he understood. They weren't bringing in the armors from the outside. They were creating them in here. That was how they circumvented the rules and gave themselves an advantage. The question was, how? How were they creating such powerful armors in such short periods of time? Scylla's knew how rare rune masters who could construct legendary items were. They practically didn't exist. The legendary path treasures in circulation now were practically all handed out by the system as rewards or hoarded by clans and organizations to hand to their offspring when the time was right. These treasures were almost always returned to the family after they had lived out the use to their uses. So what was going on? Templates. They brought in templates with them, then triggered the creation of these armors by using the crystals of these demons in place of etherstones. This place was nothing more than a simulation. The demonic ether in the air was fake. It was instead real ether that was painted with hues of demonic aura. Ultimately, the ether these demons were using was also real ether. Everything was simulated to make it seem like they were in a demon world, but if this was a real demon world, not only would the Sanctum not have any real control, the system would come down with a punishment harsh enough to wipe them all out for the crime of creating demons. Why was the distinction important? Well, aside from the fact it allowed Scylla to openly manipulate these runes without outing himself as someone with demonic will, it was also crucial because Scylla had another understanding of demons that many hadn't personally experienced before. Demonic treasures. Demons were peculiar in that upon some of the deaths, their bodies could spontaneously produce treasures. Scylla's had once had won a demonic claw treasure that could even circumvent the restrictions of his scorned wraps. But once again, these weren't real demons. They were simulations. The way the simulation was supposed to work was that a random kill had a random but incredibly small chance of triggering the birth of a demonic treasure. This treasure could then be used by participants in the battle as replacements for weapons and armors they weren't allowed to have here. What did this mean? It meant that not only were the crystals that formed the core of these demons basically just glorified etherstones, they were also etherstones ingrained with a small, but very real, possibility of triggering a hidden template within them to produce a weapon. Obviously, these chances were very low, otherwise, there would be weapons littering the battlefield by now. But it was also a very hidden mechanism as well. It had to be remembered that a demonic treasure was one that ingrained itself into the body. It was a process that didn't happen randomly but had to be accepted first. Essentially, the top-tier sanctums, likely used to the methods the Emperor Sanctum usually used, had prepared for this possibility ahead of time and were instead using their own personal templates as the vessels for triggering the creation of these treasures rather than their own bodies, thus bringing everything full circle. However, as interesting as all of this was, it still didn't quite describe why it was such a useful mechanism for Scylla's. The secret to that lay in how real demonic treasures worked. What mechanism possibly allowed a living creature to produce an inanimate object? The answer to that was in comprehensions and the way demon bodies interacted with the real plane in death. The demon claw Scylla's received didn't just pop out of thin air just because of a game-like mechanism. It appeared because the demon in question had a particularly strong claw comprehension which the real plane couldn't process properly upon its death, thus resulting in the system creating a treasure out of it in an attempt to recycle it. But what happened when the demons in question were just simulations and could be easily processed by the system around them? It meant that upon the deaths, there was no confusion at all. So where were the weapons coming from this time? The weapons were being artificially created by snatching from the existing energy of the demons. The exchange of comprehension and gene to the system and thus the creation of a weapon was all artificial, meaning all of the attack patterns of the demons were entirely built on a comprehension built from a string of programmable runes. And not only was Scylla's able to read these runes to predict these attack patterns, but he was also capable of creating openings that forced this exchange between life and weapon ahead of time, thus allowing him to kill these demons by taking advantage of their link to the system and simulation. He had already won. Chapter 1636-1. There was too much that Dynestia didn't say, half because he didn't like to talk to begin with, and another half because he felt that even he was getting lost in the weeds of what Scylla's had done. Even if Scylla's had Primus Luminaria, given the fact he wasn't using the Glassvolt Throne growth skill he used during the F-tier battles anymore, it probably meant that he was very limited in his capability to comprehend E-grade runes. Dynestia was fairly sure in his assessment of this. Scylla's should have some ability in E-grade runes, but clearly not as much as he did in F-grade runes. So how had he comprehended attack patterns of comprehensions formed by E-grade runes enough to predict them as though he was reading the future? Whatever Scylla's was doing, it ran deep. Dynestia was correct. What he didn't know was that Scylla's was someone who had mixed demonic arts as a comprehension. Compared to others, his ability to read opponents and react to their quirks and intricacies was on a completely different level. When that was matched with his runeweaver eyes and his own comprehension of runes, the three came together to form a trinity of advantages that left him feeling nigh untouchable in this respect. Maybe if it was against D-tier demons, he wouldn't be able to use this combination of factors. And also, against D-tier, his stats would be too weak even if he could. But against D-tiers, Scylla stood to his feet and walked to Nosphaline's side with a crystal in his hand. "What do you think?" Nosphaline didn't immediately reply. She knew that Scylla's wanted her to see something, and she was on the edge of understanding it, but she still wasn't quite there. However, as the seconds turned to minutes, and Scylla's patience showed no signs of waning, her eyes seemed to begin to glow more and more fiercely. All of her abilities had already reached the very end of progenitor mastery. It felt like to her there was no further to go. But Scylla's clearly didn't feel that way. She had maximized her abilities as a mesmerix would. Scylla's was able to logically understand the abilities of the mesmerix because of his profession, and thus pass on that comprehension to Nosphaline. In the end, together, they were able to instantly reach their full potential without hardly any effort at all. But no mesmerix in history had ever awakened all 9 gene beast forms. Not a single one. So even if Scylla's could pull on that knowledge and experience, there would always be some blind spots that he couldn't cover. Scylla's had never been someone to measure his success by the metrics of others. It was one thing to touch upon the limits of the mesmerics, but he was always looking for more. And he had found that for Nosphaline. Scylla's wasn't trying to show Nosphaline his rune mastery path, nor was he trying to get her to comprehend the demons. He wanted her scope to be further, much wider than that. He wanted her to feel what he felt when he was controlling the battlefield, when he was playing these demons that should have been strong enough to kill him with a single squeeze of their fingers instead in the palm of his hands. Nosphaline's eyes glazed over and a silver flame danced in her eyes. Runes began to dance around her, spontaneously forming one after another. They fell in a cascade, accelerating faster and faster until it felt like an avalanche of them was suffocating the world. Rune spark. The scene in the outside world was unlike anything anyone could have imagined. A summon reaching rune spark was unheard of, but it was something they had already been made to accept after seeing Nosphaline's armor. What they couldn't wrap their heads around was the fact that Nosphaline was only breaking into rune spark now. If she was only breaking into rune spark now, then how the hell had she drawn that armor? Suddenly, the gazes began to fall onto the Rhino youth again, their hearts shaking. Perfect spark seed. The realization hit them in waves. There was only one sort of person that could guide other spark masters so easily, one person who could allow others to enhance their own rune mastery with a mere few words, only one sort of person who could stand at the helm of all spark masters. A perfect spark seed. It wasn't just a meaningless title, nor was it merely the pinnacle of a level either. It was precisely what it said it was, the representation of perfection. The acknowledgement of not the system, but the universe itself. It meant that Silas had stepped onto a path of rune mastery that had the potential to create a system of his own in the future. The number of people here who were spark masters at the F tier was numerous, easily in the tens of thousands when the top 10 sanctums were taken into account. The numbers didn't show much of a drop-off at the E tier. They took a decent dip at the D tier, but even then there were still thousands here who had been or were current spark masters of the D tier. Even in the C tier, there were several dozen here, though there wasn't a single one of the B tier. The gap between every 50 levels was huge, but every 100 was all the more exaggerated. However, these were all just spark masters, individuals who had reached the soft cap of rune mastery. They carried around their titles grand and imposing, lofty and menacing. They took pride in it all, and maybe they were right too. But how many amongst this shocking number of geniuses had a perfect spark seed? What if one included the 3 emperors overseeing things right this moment? They, too, were grand and imposing. No. Without a doubt, they were D-tier spark masters. But were they perfect spark masters? The answer was 0. No. The answer was 1. And his name was Silas Grimblade. Chapter 1637 Perfect. The silence was heavy, heavier than any silence that had come before. Not during Silas' battle against the demons. Not when he killed an E-tier elite with a single strike. Not when he brought out the hollow wing, nor even when he used his whale warlord armor. They had already felt like Silas was a monster. This, however, it put him beyond a level of monster. It wasn't amorphous, it wasn't something intangible that slipped through their fingers every time they tried to grasp at it. It was all too real, all too solid, all too right before their faces and impossible to ignore. Primus Imperium, Primus Luminaria, Dominus Paragon. Worthless titles tied to weak sectors that could probably have been taken by any one of them had they been born in the Milky Way sector. It was a lie they could easily tell themselves without blinking, thinking themselves superior to Silas for their station in life. Not realizing the difference between being born with something and fighting for it yourself. This, though, this wasn't something that could be as easily dismissed or ignored. Maybe some of them had thought it might be possible after what they saw with the Rhino Warlord youth. But they had dismissed the idea for the sheer impossibility of it all. Now, however, there was no escaping the reality. A perfect spark master was in their midst. The atmosphere was heavy within the Emperor's skybox. Not a single one spoke. How many perfect spark masters appeared in their Emperor Sanctum? No. When was the last time one had appeared? Maybe only once or twice every generation. Every several hundred, even 1,000 years, less than a handful might appear. And every time, they were touted as a legend amongst legends. Now, even if we are wrong, we must report this, the Emperor Lizard said slowly. He was the first to push back before, now he was the one who spoke first. There was no doubt, whatever the consequences would be if they were wrong would be mitigated by the appearance of a perfect spark master. If they were correct, Silas would be dealt with. If they were wrong, Silas was still a perfect spark master. As for what the Emperor Sanctum would choose to do with him, it would be dependent on what the higher-ups decided. The value of a perfect spark seed. The greed in Elbrum's eyes flashed before it vanished. There were too few organizations with a method of extracting a perfect spark seed, and their Emperor Sanctum wasn't one of them. In addition, he was able to confirm that Dinescure's words were correct. Those were, without a doubt, the runeweaver eyes. The runeweaver profession was extremely exclusive. There was only one organization and 7 clans that could give it out. The fact Silas had it meant that he had already been marked by one of the ancestors of the Weaver Guild. However, even if it meant enraging the Weaver Guild, the importance of ensuring there was no converging onto their race's path was of the utmost importance. It was something the Sanctum would undoubtedly be willing to risk all-out war for. Even if it was against the Weaver Guild. Nosphaline's glazed eyes slowly regained their focus. Then, her aura began to methodically grow, looming larger and larger until Ch. A glass ceiling shattered and her body erupted with E-grade ether, spilling over into pools that suffocated the world around them. The crystal hearts of the demons around her shot into the air then cracked, shattering into a rain of ash as their energy was being quickly drained away. Nosphaline's body began to morph and shake, and Silas put her away into the hibernation realm. There was no need for these people to see her true form. Instead, a golden, pulsing portal appeared in the center of the battlefield, and Nosphaline swallowed it all. It moved even faster than before, the recovery percentages of the hibernation realm working overtime, so quickly that in the blink of an eye, the entire battlefield was barren. Nosphaline was only crossing over from level 50 to level 51, and yet an army of level 100 seemed only barely enough to satiate her. Silas closed his eyes, feeling Nosphaline's insights and nodding to himself. He didn't actually expect her to suddenly accelerate to level 51 because of all of this, but maybe it made sense. Beasts couldn't be rune masters, so what happened when a hybrid humanoid beast pairing appeared? One where she was somehow both an ancient beast and a spark master. It caused Nosphaline to go from a creature that was purely relying on her ancestry to one that had broken free. The problem with this, it would be all too easy for her to slip off the path of the mesmerics. Some things would be harder to execute and take advantage of. The solution? None other than Silas himself. The more perfect his understanding of his contract, the better he could guide her, and so long as his rune mastery remained beyond hers, he would certainly be capable of it. But he had his work cut out for himself. That was because the spark mastery path he had set for Nosphaline was one with no less potential than his own or his sister's. What he had been trying to show her was how the simulation was able to form things even as complex as comprehensions from little more than a series of runes. It formed the illusion of a comprehension and built the abilities of an entire being off of them, allowing them to be free-flowing and free-changing. Now, what would happen if a master of reality like the Mesmerics built a rune mastery path off of such a thing? Apparently, the answer to that was that her foundation would instantly be perfected to such an extent that she would spontaneously improve to the E-tier. Silas could hear Nosphaline's roar within the hibernation realm, a roar that would have shaken the world and shattered the E-tier battlefield itself had it occurred out here. She was ready. Chapter 1638 Lazy 1. The surging ether came to a slow stop, and the world seemed to exhale as though a great pressure that had been placed onto it had finally relaxed. Silas stood at the center of it all, looking out into the distance. He had already decided what he was going to do. After a moment, he took a seat and closed his eyes. He directly fell asleep. Silas was entirely too unpredictable. Maybe of all the things everyone expected of him now, sleeping was at the bottom of the list. But not long ago, the last thing they would have expected of him was fighting against an entire wave on his own, especially since moments earlier, he had looked like he had extended himself to the very ends of his rope to deal with the first wave. Even so, this somehow seemed even more shocking than taking on the first wave should have been. They all knew how fast Silas could move around the battlefield now, and with the advantage of not having to deal with a wave of his own, this was the best time to attack the other sanctums and deal them death blows. Since he didn't have to worry about killing off his own demon wave, he could just be a nuisance from above, peppering them with well-timed attacks and crushing them one by one. It would be the easiest and most obvious way to claim victory. But Silas wasn't doing any of that. In fact, he fell asleep on his third breath, so relaxed he didn't seem to be taking anything else seriously at all. The Emperor Skybox was completely silent when they saw this. It felt to them as though Silas was playing a game, and for some reason, it was starting to make even them uneasy. There were too many things that Silas had done that could be easily dismissed by them. Maybe he only had these things because his sector was particularly weak and he happened to be an anomaly. But a perfect spark seed, no matter how many pretzels they bent and twisted themselves into. They could never ignore that. Now, everything Silas did went from something they felt could be ignored and dealt with at a wave of the hand to something they tried to nitpick at and understand every aspect of. It was such an abrupt change, that was simultaneously agonizingly subtle, that it just slipped right into the new status quo and they didn't seem to notice it at all. The message has been sent, but there is no way to confirm if the sanctum has received it without sending another or opening ourselves up to receiving said message, the Emperor Dove said slowly. Elbram shook his head. No, it was risky enough to send it once, let's just wait. Worst case scenario, we all know where the 073 sanctum is. The higher-ups will just set up another method to deal with him. They fell into silence, but all of their eyes remained on the sleeping Silas. The uneasiness they felt in the gut was only increasing. Slowly, they began to realize that it was a matter of their luck. Their luck was warning them about something, and whatever that something was tied directly to Silas. Did that mean he really was a converging evolver? Ekir watched Silas sleep, and he actually found himself relaxing a bit. He closed his eyes and even chuckled a bit. Honestly, he couldn't remember the last time he had laughed. Inwardly, he felt quite bad about all of this. Placing so much pressure on the back of his littlest junior brother felt gross to him, but he had no choice. Revealing his own true strength would make things harder on him, not easier. If Silas was a little bit short of the ranking they needed, he planned on pushing their C-tier ranking up just enough to manage. But if they were too far away, it wouldn't be worth the risk. Now it seemed he wouldn't need to at all. He was beginning to understand a little bit more about Silas. He was an arrogant individual, and the circle of people he cared about was probably very small. In fact, Ekir himself was almost certainly not in that circle. But what was obvious enough to him was that Grelith was. If Grelith wasn't, Silas would be weighing a lot more things before he took action. But Silas clearly didn't care about the risks he was taking right now. His top priority was ensuring that Grelith would have a chance to escape. And for that, Ekir didn't care how Silas felt about him personally. He would always be a little brother to him. Ekir's smile faded and he regained his composure, his expression becoming unreadable. Time ticked by, and Silas awoke for the third wave almost a full day later. Somehow, this time, he finished them off even faster than before, his motions becoming more fluid. It took him 3 hours to finish them off earlier, but this time it took him no more than 2. Then he went back to sleep. Every time, Silas got a chance to replenish himself back to full health, his body resting to the utmost extreme. All he did was fight, and sleep, and then fight once again. After the 6th wave, he slapped his belly and activated mixed demonic arts, raising Primal Gut to legendary mastery temporarily. Then he swallowed all the fake demonic ether in the air, processed it, and then went back to sleep. There seemed to be a push and pull between how fast Silas cleared the waves and how much more powerful they were becoming. But no matter what, Silas always seemed to defeat them between 2 and 3 hours without fail. What shocked them the most, though, was that Silas' rune mastery. It seemed to somehow still be improving. Silas had never had such a good chance to refine his Archon casting on such a large scale, and as he did so in an E-grade world, his E-grade rune mastery was likewise slowly improving. Chapter 1639 Lazy. Silas' routine was more than just dull. His battle style was becoming more and more stripped down, so even when he was awake it was quite bland to watch. Yet, they couldn't take their eyes off of him. They were all looking for something, a limit, a weakness, a chink in the armor. But no matter how long they observed, that other foot didn't seem to be dropping. Silas improved faster than the waves could, and subtly, they were beginning to notice his telekinesis also becoming a sharper and better part of his combat style. Every one of these things they saw was shocking to an extreme. But the problem was that after realizing that Silas was a perfect spark master, everything else just felt pale in comparison. Silas was right about the use of telekinesis in close combat being a very unique and exclusive combat style. The amount of wisdom and skill you needed to pull off such a thing was nothing short of ridiculous. The variations, tweaks, and changes you could make in split moments were too numerous, so much so that even the most elite of the Emperor's Sanctum rarely even tried, except in very acute and practiced situations. Silas was clearly trying, and he was very, very far from succeeding, but the progress he was making in the first place was far too fast, as incremental as it was. Of course, they were not only still underestimating Silas' intellect and genius, but they also didn't know that Silas had a far more systematic method. Arcane telekinesis. While it didn't describe this method of combat in detail, the unique concepts within seemed far more conducive to helping uncover its secrets than anything else Silas had ever come across. As restrictive as the scorned raps were, it was obvious enough that the Madness disciples would have a way to make up for it, and this method of combat seemed to be that secret. Of course, Silas could take his scorned raps off whenever he wanted now. It was just that he didn't want to alert the little girl who had been oddly silent for a very long while now. Everyone's fascination with how far Silas would go, no matter how boring his combat became, didn't dull in the slightest, even as the other sanctums began to fall off one after another. By the time you got to the 10th wave, even a common soldier in the demon waves was considered an EE warrior, making them stronger than the very best sanctums beneath the 030 sanctum had to offer. But when their numbers and the general fatigue of the participants were taken into account, there were fewer than 25 sanctums remaining in total, meaning more than 15 had already been eliminated. The problem. The remaining sanctums could see that the 073 sanctum was very much still present. According to their understanding of Silas' tactics, it didn't even make sense that he was still going. It might have worked for the first or second waves, but by the third wave they were far too powerful. And if he was continuously targeting stronger sanctums to deal with those issues for him, then the number that had been eliminated should be more than 15. Nothing made sense. To those in the outside world, though, there was a curious change. After the 6th wave or so, Silas began to change locations almost frustratingly so. Unsurprisingly, the 001 and 002 sanctums were looking for him, the first because a certain ape warlord wanted to knock the Primus Imperium Conquest title down a peg, and the second for even more obvious reasons. However, they couldn't seem to pin down where he was exactly. Silas hadn't even scouted out the regions again after his first stint, but it was like he had eyes everywhere. When he moved on the 6th wave, he, barely, dodged a scout that passed right through his territory and just happened to land in a territory they had already been through. At first, it felt like it was a coincidence, but then he did it again, and then again. And as the number of sanctums decreased, the number of territories that Silas had to hide in likewise increased, making it even harder to find him. The limitations of the scouts were too much. If they didn't make it back to their own territories in time, they would have to face off against a demon wave on their own. Silas clearly knew that, and likewise knew this meant there would be a small window of time they could use to scout out other territories. They would need a certain amount of time to get to new territories and likewise return to them. They would also need to be cautious so that other sanctums didn't surround and kill them. But because Silas knew where every sanctum was after his first round of scouting, and because he could map out what territories they could scout based on timing and which ones they had been to already, he could basically play a game of musical chairs with them. This led to a situation where Silas almost lazily moved from one territory to the next, predicting their movements as though he could see the future, while the scouts ran around as though their hair had been lit on fire, wondering how just a single man could disappear. By the time they were closing in on the 14th wave and the number of sanctums had dipped below 17 left, the territories were starting to become small enough that the scouts could cover more area in a single day, and there was no way that Silas could continue to hide. And yet he did. He simply summoned Nosfaline, found some water, and took a nap at the bottom of a lake. As an E-tier now, Nosfaline's gene beast forms were so powerful they could even distract and fool some D-tiers. These E-tier scouts didn't stand a single chance. The 15th wave. The 16th. The 19th. The 20th. Chapter 1640 Survival. Silas' eyes opened from the bottom of the lake, the dark waters flowing over him in cool streams that chilled one to the bone. He put Nosfaline back into the hibernation realm and then pulled himself up to the shores. E-grade ether did have quite a good effect on him. At the very least, It was doing a much better job than what he had been doing previously in helping to fill out his new foundation as an A-grade race. It felt like every time Silas was close to building his foundation, something else would stop him. But right about now, he felt confident that he would be able to continue forward soon. Now that he had brought his race to the A grade, there was absolutely zero chance that he could progress to the E tier and lose Primus Imperium. The strongest races in the whole of the Milky Way sector were just C grade, not even close to the C+ levels. So long as he could get close to unearthing all of that A grade potential, making it to level 51 alone should be enough to leave any doubt about who the strongest E tier of their sanctum was. As he progressed, it should only get easier to maintain Primus Imperium because, as far as he was aware, there had never been a B tier born from their sector in the first place. Of course, he didn't know that with 100% certainty, and maybe there was one at some point somewhere. But whoever they were definitely small in number and should be easier to surpass by comparison, simply because of being part of such a small population. Once Silas reached that point, the only thing blocking his path to keeping Primus Imperium indefinitely was ensuring that he never lost to someone of the same tier. Now that would be far more difficult. Even Silas wasn't arrogant enough to claim that he would always be capable of such a thing, especially when there was a huge 50-level span for every tier, levels which only became more and more important, and the gaps between which only became more excessive the higher in tier you went. However, it was smarter to simply deal with one problem at a time. Name: Silas Grimblade. Species: Human Simioid A. Affiliation: Legacy 7777, Progenitor of Earth, Golden Grove Elder, Beast Warlord Sanctum 073. Class: Glassborn Christ Emperor Legendary, F. Class: Chaotic Sovereign Legendary, F. Profession: Vipermancer Bronze, E. Profession: Runeweaver DDD+. Profession: Reaper Sealwright Legendary, F. Level: 50. Coins: 837,111,132,382, F. 8,212,261, E. 1,232, D. Titles: An Infinite Will, Milky Way Progenitor, Progenitor Saint, Palms of Fate, System Chosen, Sacred Tamer, Skill Progenitor. Physical: 270,238. Greater than Strength: 270,131. Greater than Constitution: 270,245. Greater than Dexterity: 270,233. Greater than Speed: 270,342. Mental: 2,500,000. Greater than Intelligence: 2,500,000. Greater than Wisdom: 2,500,000. Greater than Charisma: 350,000. Will: 350,000. Luck: 4,011. Silas' physical stats had all gone up by around 30,000 in just a week or so. That was a more than 10% increase in such a short period of time. There was no doubt that this was in great thanks to his environment, but he was also realizing just how slow this was. And he was likewise realizing just how close to what would inevitably be his limits he was getting. Logically, he should be able to improve his physical stats to at least around 350,000 or so. Not accounting for titles and things of the like, this number seemed to be around the max. A creature like the World Serpent had stats around 450,000, and it was a creature of absolute perfection, representing what would probably be around the best the S grade had. Of course, that didn't include what titles and other advantages it would have. Its main body probably had stats closer to 7 figures, if not above that, at level 50. By Silas' calculations, an A-grade race who was on the verge of the A+ level like his Grimblades had been after turning down a chance to become demigods. He should have at least 80,000 more physical stat points in him somewhere. But he just couldn't unearth it. Silas knew this was a limitation of having a body that started at the F grade. He had too many faulty pipes within himself to suddenly become perfect. His children would certainly not have this problem. Of course, Silas had once had a solution to this, the Duchess. But he had said he wouldn't use that method anymore. So, he would need another. Silas stretched, his body popping and his tendons roaring as it unleashed hidden strength and power. He had a few ideas. Whether they would work, though, well, that was another matter entirely. Sex was one of the things that spiked evolution. The desire to pass on genes was something universal, so universal that Silas could even make use of the lust seed to purge himself of his weaknesses. But there was something even more fundamental than sex, something that, if one did without, procreation would be nothing more than a figment of the imagination. Survival. Silas stepped onto the surface of the lake, having risen to the very top slowly only to find himself surrounded by 3 armies, each made up of several dozen elites. The 001 Sanctum. The 002 Sanctum. The 007 Sanctum. He didn't seem surprised at all by the changes. If he had wanted to avoid it, he wouldn't have stayed in this one location for the last 3 waves. There were plenty of other lakes and bodies of water he could have made use of, but he decided not to. He looked up into the skies to see that there were 9 sanctums remaining. Including himself, that meant there were only 8 others. It seemed the 007 Sanctum was truly cutting it close. Or maybe they no longer cared, since their ranking would be about the same no matter what now. After all, they were one of the 2 Sanctums with Grelith's spirit beast at the core of their scorpion lineage, and it was unsurprising that their scorpion warlord would be here as a result. Quick update. I'm just as excited as you are for the next part. Just to clarify, I'm dependent on the official online novel site for the source material. Since those new chapters haven't been posted yet, I won't be able to record and upload new audio chapters for a little while. I'm checking the site daily and will start production the moment they go live. Your patience is appreciated.